Hi guys, what if the bread that fed entire civilizations for thousands of years is fundamentally different from what you're eating right now? And what if that difference is quietly destroying your health in ways you've never connected? Before we start, likes and subscribes help me keep making these. Where are you listening from? Drop your city and time in the comments. I'm always reading them, thinking, wait, people in Miami listen to history stories to sleep. Okay, tonight we're talking about why medieval bread was surprisingly healthy while your modern bread makes you sick. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Pillows good, blanket situation handled. Perfect, trust me on this one. You're standing in a bakery in 1324 somewhere outside York in northern England. It's early morning, maybe 4 or 5, and the air is thick with wood smoke and the smell of dough that's been rising all night. You can't see across the street because of the smoke. The baker, a man named Thomas, has been awake since midnight. His hands are dusted white, his apron stained dark from years of use. He pulls a loaf from the stone oven, and it's heavy in his grip, dense and dark, almost brown. The crust crackles as it cools. This bread will feed a family of 6 for the day. £2 per person, maybe 3 if the work is hard. And the work is always hard. Now you're standing in a grocery store in 2025. There are loaves of bread of all sizes. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. You're holding a loaf of bread that weighs almost nothing. It's soft, pillowy, white as snow. The ingredient list wraps around the bag like a legal document. Enriched wheat flour, high fructose corn syrup, soybean oil, calcium propionate, azodicarbonamide. You can't pronounce half of it. You put it in your cart anyway because it's cheap, because it's convenient, because it's what everyone buys. You eat 2 slices with lunch. An hour later, you're hungry again. Your stomach feels tight. Your head feels foggy. You assume this is normal. It's not normal, it's just common. The medieval peasant, the one you've been taught to pity, the one who supposedly lived a short, brutal, ignorant life, he knew something about bread that you don't. He knew it intimately, the way you know your phone's battery percentage or your coffee order. Bread wasn't just food to him, it was survival, it was currency. It was the centre of his day, his week, his year. And the bread he ate, that dark, heavy, slow fermented loaf, it didn't bloat him. It didn't spike his blood sugar. It didn't trigger inflammation or leave him craving more an hour later. It sustained him through 12-hour days in the fields, through winters that could kill, through labour that would flatten most modern people in an afternoon. So what changed? Not your body. Not human digestion. Not the fundamental biology of wheat. What changed was the wheat itself, the way it's grown, the way it's milled, the way it's processed, the way it's sold. What changed was that somewhere between Thomas pulling that loaf from his oven in 1324 and you pulling that plastic-wrapped loaf from a shelf in 2025, bread stopped being bread. It became a product. And your body knows the difference, even if your mind doesn't. You're back in that village outside York. The year is still 1324, and you're watching Thomas work. He's not following a recipe. There is no recipe. There's only repetition, only habit, only the knowledge passed down from his father, who learned it from his father, who learned it generations back. Thomas doesn't measure anything, he feels the dough. He knows when it's right by the way it resists his hands, by the slight stickiness, by the smell of fermentation just beginning to turn sour. This is instinct now, muscle memory, bread making as reflex. The dough has been sitting since yesterday afternoon. 20 hours, maybe more. It's not made with commercial yeast, because commercial yeast doesn't exist yet. It's made with a starter culture, a living mixture of wild yeast and bacteria that Thomas keeps in a clay pot near the hearth. His wife Agnes feeds it every few days with flour and water. It smells sharp, acidic, alive. When Thomas mixes it into the dough, the culture goes to work. It consumes the sugars in the flour. It produces lactic acid and acetic acid. It breaks down proteins and starches in ways that make the bread easier to digest, more nutritious, less likely to cause the kind of problems you'd recognise today as gluten sensitivity or irritable bowel syndrome. Thomas doesn't know any of this. He doesn't know about bacteria or fermentation chemistry or glycemic index. He just knows that if you rush the dough, the bread turns out wrong. It doesn't rise properly. It doesn't taste right. It doesn't keep you full. So he waits. Waiting is part of the process. Patience is baked into the recipe. The flour he's using came from the mill down by the river. It was ground 3 days ago between 2 massive stones, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, turned slowly by the current. The wheat itself was harvested in September, threshed by hand, stored in the manor's granary. It's a landrace variety, something his great-great-grandfather would recognise, a strain adapted over centuries to the local soil, the local climate, the local pests. The stalks were tall, uneven, some ripening earlier than others. Not efficient by modern standards, but resilient. The grain is whole when it goes into the mill. The bran, the germ, the endosperm, all ground together into a coarse, greyish flour that still smells faintly of the field. This flour has everything: fibre, healthy fats, B vitamins, magnesium, zinc, iron. The oils in the wheat germ are still intact because the stone mill grinds slowly, generating almost no heat. Those oils contain vitamin E and omega-3 fatty acids. They'll go rancid in a few weeks, which is why Thomas buys flour regularly, why there's no such thing as flour that sits on a shelf for months. Freshness isn't a marketing term, it's a necessity. You're watching him shape the dough now. His hands are strong, scarred, permanently stained. He divides it into loaves, each one weighing about 2 pounds. He scores the tops with a knife, a simple cross pattern that lets steam escape during baking. Then he slides them into the oven, a stone chamber heated by a wood fire that's been burning since before dawn. The temperature is uneven, hotter near the coals, cooler toward the back. Thomas knows this. He rotates the loaves halfway through. He judges doneness by the colour of the crust, by the sound it makes when he taps it with his knuckle. No timers, no thermometers, just experience. When the bread comes out, it's dark, almost mahogany, with a crust so hard you could knock on a door with it. The interior is dense, chewy, filled with irregular holes where the wild yeast did its work. It doesn't look like the bread you know. It doesn't smell like it either. It smells earthy, tangy, complex. It will stay edible for days, even a week if stored properly. And when you eat it, it fills you. Not just your stomach, it sustains you in a way that feels different, deeper, more complete. Thomas will sell most of these loaves today, a few pennies each. The rest will go to his own family. His children will eat it with cheese, with onions, with whatever vegetables Agnes can pull from the garden. They'll eat it for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner. It's 70% of their calories, maybe more, and they'll thrive on it. You're sitting at Thomas's table now, in the single room that serves as kitchen, workshop and sleeping quarters for his family of 7. The fire is low, just embers glowing in the hearth, enough to keep the chill off but not enough to waste wood. It's evening, maybe an hour after sunset, and the only light comes from a single tallow candle that smells faintly of mutton fat. Agnes is cutting bread. Not slicing it really, because medieval knives aren't designed for precision. She's tearing chunks off the loaf, thick pieces that she hands to each child in turn. The oldest, a boy of maybe 12, gets the biggest piece. He's been working in the fields all day with his father. The youngest, a girl of 4, gets the smallest. She gnaws at it with her baby teeth, and it takes her a long time. There's no butter. Butter is expensive, something you make once a week if you're lucky, something you sell if you need money. There's a little bit of hard cheese, though, made from sheep's milk, sharp and crumbly. Agnes portions it out carefully. There are onions, too, roasted in the coals earlier, soft and sweet now. And that's dinner. Bread, cheese, onions. Maybe some ale, weak stuff that's safer to drink than the water from the well. This is what sustains them. This is what fuels a 12-hour workday, what keeps children growing, what keeps Agnes pregnant every 2 years like clockwork, what keeps Thomas's muscles strong enough to lift stones and swing a scythe and haul sacks of grain. You're thinking this sounds grim, monotonous, nutritionally inadequate. You're thinking about vitamin deficiencies, about scurvy and rickets and all the diseases you associate with pre-modern life. But here's the thing that nobody tells you, the thing that doesn't fit the narrative you've been taught about how much better everything is now. These people aren't sick, not the way you're sick. Thomas doesn't have diabetes, Agnes doesn't have irritable bowel syndrome, their children don't have ADHD or chronic fatigue, or the kind of brain fog that makes you forget why you walked into a room. They don't have autoimmune diseases, they don't have the epidemic of obesity that defines modern life. They're not collapsing from blood sugar crashes an hour after eating. They're eating bread, massive amounts of bread, 2 pounds a day, every day for their entire lives, and their bodies are handling it just fine. Better than fine, actually, because that bread, that dense, dark, slow-fermented loaf, it's not spiking their blood sugar, it's not triggering inflammation, it's not leaving them hungry and irritable and desperate for more food. It's releasing energy slowly, steadily, the way food is supposed to. The fibre in the whole grain flour is slowing down digestion. The fermentation has broken down the phytic acid that would otherwise bind to minerals and prevent absorption. The wild yeast has pre-digested the gluten, making it easier for their bodies to process. They're getting complete nutrition from bread because bread, real bread, traditional bread, is actually a complete food. Now you're back in 2025, standing in your kitchen, looking at that loaf you bought from the grocery store. You're hungry. You've been hungry all day, actually, even though you've been eating. You had cereal for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, carbs, carbs, carbs. but you're still hungry because your blood sugar has been on a roller coaster since you woke up. Spike, crash, crash. Your body is confused, your hormones are screaming, your pancreas is dumping insulin like it's trying to put out a fire, and in a way, it is. Because every time you eat that bread, that soft white industrial bread, your blood sugar shoots up faster than it would if you ate pure table sugar. The glycemic index of white bread is 75, table sugar is 65. You're literally better off eating candy. But you don't know this. Nobody told you this. The bread looks harmless. It's been marketed to you your entire life as wholesome, as nutritious, as the foundation of a balanced diet. The food pyramid, remember that? Bread at the bottom, 6 to 11 servings a day. They taught you that in school. They taught you that bread was good for you, necessary, essential. And you believed it, because why wouldn't you? Bread has been food for thousands of years. Bread built civilizations. Bread is the staff of life. Except the bread they were talking about, the bread that built civilizations, the bread that was the staff of life, that was Thomas's bread. That was slow-fermented, stone-ground, whole-grain, wild yeast bread, made from wheat that hadn't been genetically manipulated for yield. That was bread that took 20 hours to make, bread that came from wheat with 14 chromosomes instead of 42, bread that was milled fresh and baked the same day and eaten within a week. That bread deserved to be called the staff of life. Your bread, the stuff in the plastic bag with the ingredient list you can't pronounce, that's not the same thing at all. That's a science experiment. That's a profit optimization strategy wrapped in marketing. And your body knows the difference, even if your conscious mind doesn't. You're in a field now, somewhere in medieval England, maybe Lincolnshire or Norfolk, one of those flat, endless places where the sky takes up more space than the land. It's August, harvest time, and the wheat is ready. The stalks are tall, taller than you, reaching up past your waist, past your chest, some of them as high as your shoulder. They're golden in the sunlight, moving in waves when the wind picks up, and the sound they make is like whispering, thousands of stalks brushing against each other. It's beautiful in a way that feels almost alien now, because you've never seen wheat like this. You've seen wheat fields from highways, those low, uniform carpets of grain that barely reach your knee, engineered for combine harvesters and maximum yield per acre. But this is different. This wheat is a landrace variety. Nobody calls it that, of course, because the term won't be invented for another 600 years. But that's what it is. A strain that's been grown in this region for generations, adapted slowly to the local soil, the local rainfall patterns, the local pests and diseases. It's not uniform. Some stalks are taller, some shorter, some are ripening faster, their heads already drooping with the weight of grain, while others are still green. This drives modern agronomists crazy when they look at historical records. How inefficient, they say, how primitive. But the medieval farmer knows something they don't. This variation is insurance. If a disease sweeps through, some plants will resist. If there's a late frost or an early drought, some stalks will survive. Diversity equals resilience. Monoculture equals vulnerability. The wheat itself, the actual grain, it has 14 chromosomes. This is einkorn, the oldest cultivated wheat, the stuff that started civilization 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. Or maybe it's emmer, with 28 chromosomes, the wheat that built Egypt, that fed the workers who dragged limestone blocks up ramps to build pyramids. Either way, it's genetically simple compared to what comes later. The gluten structure is weak, which means the dough won't rise as dramatically, won't trap as much air, won't produce those soft fluffy loaves you're used to. But that weak gluten is exactly what makes it digestible. The proteins are structured in a way your digestive enzymes can actually break down. Your immune system doesn't freak out when it encounters them. Your gut lining doesn't get inflamed. You're watching the harvest now, a line of workers moving through the field with sickles, curved blades that catch the stalks and cut them close to the ground. It's back-breaking work, literally. You're bent over for hours, grabbing handfuls of wheat, slicing through the stems, laying the stalks in neat rows to dry. Your back screams, your hands blister. The sun beats down, and there's no shade, no water break, no OSHA regulations. This is why harvest time requires everyone. Men, women, older children, even the elderly who can still grip a sickle. The whole village turns out because if you don't get the wheat in before the weather turns, before the rain comes and rots it in the field, people will starve this winter. It's that simple, that direct. Your survival depends on this grain. Once it's cut and dried, they thresh it, beating the stalks with flails, wooden tools that look like medieval weapons, until the grain separates from the chaff. Then winnowing, tossing it into the air so the wind carries away the lightweight husks and the heavy grain falls back down. It's tedious, repetitive, exhausting. But by the end, you have clean grain, ready to store or mill. And this grain, this simple, ancient wheat, it's packed with nutrition in a way that modern wheat isn't. 30% more protein, 4 times more beta-carotene, which your body converts to vitamin A, higher levels of lutein and zeaxanthin, antioxidants that protect your eyes and your brain from oxidative damage, more zinc, more iron, more magnesium. The nutrient density is astonishing compared to modern wheat, which has been bred for yield, not nutrition. Every genetic modification, every selective breeding choice over the past century has optimized for how much grain you can produce per acre, not for how much nourishment that grain provides per bite. And here's the crucial part, the part that changes everything. This wheat, this ancient, unmodified wheat, it hasn't been sprayed with anything. No pesticides, because pesticides don't exist yet. No herbicides, because herbicides don't exist yet. No glyphosate, no Roundup, no pre-harvest desiccation to speed up the drying process and make harvesting more convenient. It's just wheat, grown in soil that's been fertilized with manure and enriched through crop rotation. Harvested by hand, stored in dry barns, eventually milled into flour that still contains everything the grain started with: the bran, the germ, the endosperm, all ground together. Nothing added, nothing taken away. Just wheat, the way it's been for thousands of years, the way your ancestors' bodies learned to process it, the way your digestive system still expects it to be. You're standing inside the mill now, and the first thing that hits you is the sound. It's not loud exactly, but it's constant, a deep grinding rumble that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. The millstones are moving, two massive circles of granite or limestone, each one weighing somewhere between 500 and 1,000 pounds. The bottom stone is stationary, fixed to the floor of the mill. The top stone, the runner stone, rotates slowly above it, driven by a wooden shaft connected to a water wheel outside. You can hear the river through the walls, the rush of water over the wheel, the creaking of wood under stress. This mill has been here for 80 years, maybe longer. The miller's grandfather built it, and when it finally falls apart, his grandson will probably build another one in the same spot. The gap between the two stones is tiny, maybe the width of a few grains of wheat, adjusted carefully by the miller using a wooden lever. Too wide and the flour comes out coarse, full of chunks. Too narrow and the stones bind up, generating heat that can scorch the grain and ruin the flavor. The miller knows this by instinct now, by the sound the stones make, by the feel of the flour when he runs it through his fingers. He's been doing this since he was a boy, learning the trade from his father, who learned it from his father. There's no formal education, no certification, no regulatory body checking his work. There's just reputation. If the miller produces bad flour, people stop coming to his mill. If he produces good flour, consistently, year after year, his family stays fed. The wheat goes in through a hole in the top stone, a funnel called a hopper that feeds grain into the center where the stones meet. Gravity does most of the work. The spinning stone catches the grain and forces it outward, crushing it between the two surfaces as it moves toward the edge. The flour spills out into a wooden trough, still warm from the friction, and the smell is incredible. Fresh, earthy, almost sweet. Nothing like the flour you buy in paper bags at the store, which smells like nothing, like cardboard, like something that died months ago and was preserved through chemistry. This flour smells alive, because it basically is. The oils in the wheat germ are still intact, the enzymes haven't been destroyed, the vitamins haven't oxidized into uselessness. But here's the critical detail, the thing that makes this flour fundamentally different from what you're used to. The stones grind slowly, the water wheel turns at maybe 10 or 15 rotations per minute, which means the runner stone is moving at a walking pace, not the high-speed blur of modern roller mills. This matters because grinding generates heat. Friction between stone and grain creates thermal energy, and if that temperature gets too high, it damages the flour. It destroys the delicate oils in the wheat germ, the ones that contain vitamin E and omega-3 fatty acids. It breaks down the B vitamins, it alters the protein structure in ways that make the flour harder to digest. Stone milling, slow stone milling, keeps the temperature low. The flour never gets hot enough to damage the nutrients. Everything that was in the grain is still in the flour, and everything really is still in the flour. The bran, the hard outer layer that's full of fiber and minerals, the germ, the embryo of the wheat kernel, packed with healthy fats and vitamins. The endosperm, the starchy interior that modern white flour is made from exclusively. In stone-ground flour, you're getting all three, ground together into a coarse, greyish powder that looks nothing like the snow-white flour you're familiar with. This flour won't make soft, fluffy bread. It makes dense, heavy bread. Bread with texture and chew and substance. Bread that fills you up and keeps you full for hours because the fiber slows down digestion, because the fats provide sustained energy, because the complete nutrition signals to your body that you've actually eaten something valuable. The miller bags the flour in rough cloth sacks, maybe 20 pounds each, and farmers come to collect it throughout the week. There's no long-term storage because there can't be. Those oils in the wheat germ, the ones that make this flour so nutritious, they'll go rancid in a month, maybe 6 weeks if you keep the flour somewhere cool and dry. This is before refrigeration, before vacuum sealing, before any of the preservation technologies you take for granted. Freshness isn't a marketing term, it's a requirement. You mill the grain, you use the flour, you mill more grain. The cycle repeats weekly, sometimes more often during busy seasons. Nobody's making flour in January to use in July. That would be insane. The flour would be rancid, possibly toxic, definitely inedible. Now jump forward to 1870. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and someone has invented roller mills. steel rollers, spinning at high speeds, crushing grain between them in stages. First pass, you crack the kernel open. Second pass, you separate the bran and germ from the endosperm. Third pass, you grind the endosperm into fine white powder. It's faster than stone milling, dramatically faster. It's more efficient. It produces more flour per hour, per day, per year. And critically, it produces flour that won't go rancid because you've removed the parts that go rancid. The bran and germ, with all their oils and vitamins and minerals, they're waste products now. They get sold as animal feed. What's left is pure white endosperm, pure starch, nutritionally bankrupt but shelf-stable for months, even years if you store it properly. This is the moment. This is when bread stops being bread and becomes a product. This is when the ancient compact between humans and wheat, a relationship tens of thousands of years old, gets broken in favor of profit margins and distribution logistics. You're in Thomas's bakery again, but it's night now, and you're watching something that looks almost ceremonial in its slowness. Thomas has mixed his dough hours ago, back when the sun was still up. Flour, water, salt, and a few spoonfuls of starter culture from that clay pot by the hearth. He's kneaded it briefly, just enough to bring it together, and now it's sitting in a wooden trough, covered with a damp cloth, waiting, fermenting, transforming. This is where the magic happens. Though Thomas wouldn't call it magic, he'd call it common sense, or tradition, or just the way you make bread. But if you could see what's happening inside that dough at a microscopic level, you'd understand why this step, this waiting period, is the single most important difference between medieval bread and the stuff you're eating now. The starter culture Thomas added is teeming with life. Wild yeast, captured from the air, and the grain itself. Dozens of different strains, lactic acid bacteria, the same kind that turn milk into yogurt and cabbage into sauerkraut. These microorganisms are eating the sugars in the flour, metabolizing them, producing carbon dioxide that makes the dough rise, and organic acids that give it that distinctive sour tang. But they're doing something else, something more important than flavor or texture. They're breaking down the components of wheat that your body struggles to process. Gluten, that family of proteins everyone's suddenly afraid of, it's being partially digested by the bacteria. The long protein chains are being snipped into shorter fragments that your digestive enzymes can handle more easily. Phytic acid, a compound in the bran that binds to minerals like iron and zinc and calcium and prevents your body from absorbing them. It's being neutralized by enzymes activated in the acidic environment. Lectins, proteins that can irritate your gut lining and trigger immune responses, they're being reduced. Enzyme inhibitors that interfere with digestion, they're being deactivated. By the time this dough is ready to bake, it's been fundamentally transformed at a molecular level. It's still wheat, still flour and water and salt, but it's been pre-digested by bacteria in ways that make it dramatically easier for your body to handle. The nutrients are more bioavailable, the proteins are less likely to trigger inflammation, the starches are more complex, slower to digest, less likely to spike your blood sugar. This is why Thomas can eat 2 pounds of this bread every day without getting sick. This is why his children thrive on a diet that's 70% bread. The fermentation has turned wheat from something moderately digestible into something highly digestible. It's not just food, it's optimized food, perfected through thousands of years of trial and error, refined by generations of bakers who didn't understand the chemistry, but understood the results. Thomas checks the dough. He presses a finger into it, watching how quickly the indentation fills back in. Not quite ready, he covers it again and goes to tend the fire. The oven needs to be hot, properly hot by the time the dough is ready. He adds more wood, arranges the coals, checks the temperature by holding his hand inside for a few seconds. Too hot, and the crust will burn before the interior cooks. Too cool, and the bread will be dense and gummy. There's no thermometer, there's no temperature gauge, there's just experience and intuition, and the willingness to pay attention. Hours pass. It's past midnight now. The village is silent except for the occasional dog barking or the wind in the thatch. Thomas checks the dough again. This time when he presses it, the indentation stays. The dough has risen fully, expanded to nearly double its original size, and the surface is slightly domed, pulling tight across the top. It smells sour, yeasty, complex. He uncovers it and begins shaping loaves, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He doesn't need to think about what he's doing, his muscles remember. Each loaf gets shaped, scored, and placed on a wooden peel, the long-handled paddle he'll use to slide them into the oven. The baking takes about an hour. Thomas pulls the loaves out one at a time, checking the color, listening to the sound they make when he taps the bottom. A hollow thump means they're done. He sets them on a rack to cool, and even though it's the middle of the night, even though he's exhausted from a full day of work, he stands there for a moment just looking at them. 6 loaves, dark and heavy, crackling as they cool. This is his craft. This is what he knows. Tomorrow his family will eat this bread, and the day after that. It will keep them alive, it will keep them healthy. And he doesn't need to understand fermentation chemistry or glycemic index or nutrient bioavailability to know that what he's made is good. Now you're back in your kitchen, and you're looking at a recipe you found online for quick bread. Mix flour, baking powder, sugar, milk and oil. Stir until combined, pour Pour into a pan, bake for 40 minutes, done. No waiting, no fermentation, no wild yeast or bacteria breaking down anti-nutrients and pre-digesting proteins. Just raw flour and chemical leavening agents, and a prayer that your digestive system can handle it. And maybe it can for a while. But this isn't what your body evolved to eat. This isn't what sustained humans for millennia. This is a shortcut, a hack, a convenience that comes with costs you won't notice until years later when your gut is inflamed and your blood sugar is unstable and you can't figure out why you feel terrible all the time. You're walking through a medieval village market now, somewhere in France, maybe Provence or Burgundy. And the year is 1289. It's Saturday, market day, and the square is crowded with people buying and selling everything they need for the week ahead. Cloth merchants, leather workers, a man selling iron nails from a cart, a woman with a basket of eggs balanced on her hip. And bakers, 3 of them, maybe 4, each with a table stacked with loaves. The bread is different at each stall, some darker, some lighter, some round, some oblong. Different shapes mean different prices, different qualities, different types of grain. This one is pure wheat, expensive, for the merchant families and the minor nobility. That one is maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, cheaper, what most people buy. Over there is barley bread, the cheapest of all, dense and dark and filling, what the poorest families eat when they can't afford anything else. You're noticing something interesting though. The customers aren't just buying bread, they're inspecting it. A woman picks up a loaf, weighs it in her hands, squeezes it gently to check the texture, sniffs it, even breaks off a small piece to examine the crumb. She's not being rude, this is expected. This is how you buy bread in a world where quality varies dramatically from baker to baker, where there's no standardization, no regulatory oversight, no ingredients label to consult. You judge bread by its weight, its appearance, its smell, its texture. You learn what good bread feels like, and you don't buy from bakers who consistently produce bad bread. Reputation is everything. A baker who shorts his customers on weight, who adulterates his flour with cheaper grains or sawdust or chalk, who produces sour bread that makes people sick, that baker doesn't stay in business long. The market is self-regulating, brutally so. There are laws actually about bread. The assize of bread, established in England in 1266 and copied throughout Europe, sets legal standards for weight and price. A loaf must weigh a certain amount depending on the price of grain that week. If wheat is expensive, loaves get smaller. If wheat is cheap, loaves get bigger. But the relationship between price and weight is fixed by law, enforced by local officials who can fine bakers, confiscate their goods, even ban them from baking if they cheat too egregiously. This seems quaint maybe, like medieval bureaucracy run amok, but it's actually revealing something important about how seriously people took bread. It wasn't just food, it was life itself. And cheating people on bread was considered a crime serious enough to require government intervention. You're watching a transaction now. A man, probably a labourer based on his clothes, is buying 2 loaves of maslin. He hands over a few coins, small silver pennies worn smooth from use, and the baker wraps the bread in a piece of rough cloth. The man tucks the loaves under his arm and walks away, and you're struck by how much of his daily wages just went to bread. Maybe a third, maybe half. Bread is expensive relative to income, in ways that modern people don't really understand. You probably spend 5% of your income on food, maybe 10% if you eat out a lot. A medieval labourer might spend 60 or 70% of his income just on bread and ale. Everything else, clothes, tools, candles, fuel for heating, that all has to come out of what's left. This is why harvest failures are catastrophic. This is why bad weather can trigger famines. When the price of grain doubles, people starve, not because food disappears entirely, but because they can no longer afford the bread that makes up most of their calories. But here's the paradox that nobody talks about. Despite spending most of their income on bread, despite eating bread for every meal, despite consuming 2 or 3 pounds of it every single day, these people aren't suffering from the diseases you'd expect. They're not diabetic, they're not obese, they're not dealing with epidemic levels of autoimmune disorders. Their teeth are bad, sure, because dental care doesn't exist and because stone-ground flour sometimes has tiny fragments of stone in it that wear down enamel. They die from infections and accidents and childbirth complications, and diseases we can cure now with antibiotics. But they're not dying from metabolic disease, they're not dying from the slow-motion catastrophes that define modern health, the heart disease and diabetes and cancer that kill millions every year in wealthy countries where food is abundant and cheap and available 24 hours a day. The bread they're eating, that expensive, carefully regulated, slowly fermented bread, it's not poisoning them, it's sustaining them. And the difference between their bread and your bread isn't just a matter of processing or convenience or modern efficiency. It's a matter of fundamental biochemistry, of how wheat interacts with the human digestive system, of whether food is designed to nourish or designed to sell. Their bread was food. Your bread is a product engineered to maximize profit, shelf life and visual appeal, with nutritional value as an afterthought, if it's considered at all. You watch another customer, a woman this time, buying bread from a different baker. She's choosing carefully, comparing loaves, asking questions. How long did this ferment? What kind of wheat? When was it baked? The baker answers patiently. He knows her. She's been buying from him for years, just like her mother bought from his father. This is a relationship, not a transaction. He stakes his reputation on every loaf he sells, and if the bread is bad, if it makes her sick or doesn't satisfy, she'll go to a different baker next week. It's that simple, that direct. Quality matters because quality is visible, tangible, immediate. You're inside a manor house now, the kind of place where the local lord lives with his family and household staff. It's evening, dinner time, and you're sitting at the far end of a long wooden table in the great hall. The room is large, drafty despite the fire burning in the enormous hearth at one end. Smoke drifts up toward the roof, escaping through gaps in the thatch, or sometimes just lingering in the rafters, staining the beams black over years and decades. The lord sits at the head of the table with his wife and children. Below them, arranged in strict order of importance, are the steward, the bailiff, the head groom, the household servants, and at the very end, near where you're sitting, the lowest-ranking members of the household. Everyone eats together, but not everyone eats the same food. The bread tells you everything about status. At the lord's end of the table, the bread is white. Not pure white like modern bread, but lighter than what everyone else is eating, made from wheat flour that's been sifted through cloth to remove most of the bran. This is manchet, the finest bread available, soft and relatively light, baked in small round loaves that look almost delicate compared to the massive peasant loaves you've seen. The lord's family eats this bread with butter, with soft cheese, with slices of roasted meat. They tear pieces off and use them to soak up juices and sauces, and when the bread gets too soggy, too stained with grease and gravy, they toss it to the dogs sleeping under the table, or leave it for the servants to eat later. As you move down the table, the bread gets darker and coarser. The steward and bailiff eat wheat bread, but it's less refined, brownish, heavier. Further down, the household servants eat maslin, that wheat-rye mixture that's cheaper and denser. And at your end, the lowest end, you're eating bread that's almost black, heavy as a stone, made from a mixture that probably includes barley and maybe peas or beans ground into the flour to make it stretch further. This bread isn't bad exactly. It's filling, it's nutritious in its way. But it's a clear marker of where you stand in the social hierarchy. You are what you eat, literally, and everyone in this room can tell your status by looking at the bread on your plate. But here's what's interesting. Despite the differences in refinement and appearance, all of this bread is still real bread. Even the coarsest barley bean mixture has been stone ground and naturally fermented. Even the cheapest loaf sitting in front of you has gone through the same basic process. Grain to flour, flour to dough, dough fermented for hours or overnight, then baked. The Lord's white bread is easier to digest, sure, because some of the fibre has been removed, because the gluten structure is lighter. But your dark bread has more nutrients, more minerals, more of the components that were in the original grain. You're getting the bran, the germ, everything. It's harder to chew, takes longer to digest, but it's keeping you full for hours. It's doing its job. Nobody at this table, from the Lord down to you, is eating bread that contains high fructose corn syrup, or soybean oil, or preservatives, or dough conditioners, or any of the dozens of chemicals that show up in modern bread. Nobody is eating bread made from wheat that's been genetically altered to have 42 chromosomes instead of 14 or 28. Nobody is eating bread that's been mixed, risen, and baked in under 3 hours with no fermentation, no bacterial breakdown of anti-nutrients, no enzymatic transformation of the flour. The bread might reflect social status, but it's all still food, real food. Food that your body recognizes and can process without triggering inflammation or blood sugar chaos. You're watching the Lord's young son, maybe 8 years old, eating his white bread with obvious pleasure. He's thin, active, healthy-looking despite living in an era with no antibiotics, no vaccines, no modern medicine. He'll probably eat bread at every meal for his entire life, just like everyone else in this room, just like everyone else in the village, just like everyone else in medieval Europe. Bread is the foundation of the diet across all social classes. And yet, despite this carbohydrate-heavy diet, despite eating what modern nutritionists would probably consider an alarming amount of grain-based food, metabolic disease is virtually unknown. Diabetes is so rare that when physicians encounter it, they write about it in medical texts as a curiosity. Obesity exists, but only among the very wealthy who eat enormous amounts of meat and fat and imported luxuries. The normal pattern, the default state for most people, is to be relatively lean, relatively healthy, fueled primarily by bread and ale and seasonal vegetables. The meal is ending now, servants are clearing the table, and you notice they're collecting the bread that's been left behind. The trenchers, thick slices that were used as edible plates, soaked with meat juices and sauces. These will be given to the poor who gather at the manor gate every evening. Nothing is wasted. Even the scraps, the pieces too dirty or soggy to eat, will go to the pigs or the chickens. Bread is too valuable, too expensive, too labor-intensive to produce, to throw away carelessly. Every ounce represents hours of work, from ploughing the field to harvesting the grain, to milling the flour, to fermenting and baking the dough. You don't waste that, you can't afford to. And this attitude, this deep respect for bread as something precious and essential, it's completely alien to modern sensibility. You throw away bread without thinking about it. The end pieces nobody wants, the slices that got mouldy in the bag, the hot dog buns left over from summer cookouts. Into the trash, no guilt, no second thought. Because bread is cheap now, absurdly cheap. You can buy a loaf for $2, maybe $3, less than the cost of a coffee. And because it's cheap, because it's abundant, because it's everywhere, you don't value it. You don't think about what went into making it, or what it's doing to your body when you eat it. You're in a field again, but this time it's 1961, and everything looks different. The wheat barely comes up to your knees. The stalks are short, thick, uniform, standing in perfect rows that stretch to the horizon without variation. There's no diversity here, no tall stalks mixed with short ones, no early ripening mixed with late. Every plant looks identical because they are identical, genetically speaking. This is semi-dwarf wheat, the miracle crop that won Norman Borlaug the Nobel Peace Prize, the foundation of what they called the Green Revolution. And it's about to change everything about bread, about wheat, about human health, in ways nobody is predicting or even thinking about. Borlaug wasn't trying to create a health crisis. He was trying to feed people, and by that measure he succeeded spectacularly. His wheat varieties produced 2, sometimes 3 times the yield of traditional wheat. They were resistant to rust and other diseases that had devastated crops for centuries. They responded well to synthetic fertilizers, growing faster and fuller than heritage varieties. They could be planted closer together because the short stalks didn't fall over under the weight of the grain heads. From a pure production standpoint, from an agricultural efficiency standpoint, this was revolutionary. Millions of people in Mexico, in India and Pakistan, people who had been on the edge of starvation, suddenly had enough to eat. Famine, the ancient enemy, the thing that had killed millions throughout human history, was being pushed back. But there was a cost, and nobody was measuring it. To create wheat that produced more grain per acre, plant breeders had to fundamentally alter the genetic structure of the plant. They crossed different species, introduced genes from wild grasses, used radiation and chemical mutagens to speed up the breeding process. The wheat that emerged from this process had 42 chromosomes instead of the 14 in einkorn or the 28 in emmer. More chromosomes meant more genetic complexity, more proteins, more compounds that human digestive systems had never encountered before. The gluten structure changed. It became stronger, more elastic, better for making the soft, fluffy bread that modern consumers preferred. But that stronger gluten was also harder to digest, more likely to trigger immune responses, more inflammatory. The gliadin fraction of gluten, the part that causes the most problems for people with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, it was structurally different in this new wheat. Studies that wouldn't be conducted until decades later found proteins in modern wheat that simply didn't exist in heritage varieties. Your body, your immune system, your digestive enzymes, they were encountering something novel, something foreign, something they hadn't evolved to process. And for some people, maybe a small percentage at first, this triggered reactions, digestive problems, skin rashes, brain fog, joint pain, chronic fatigue. But these symptoms were vague, hard to diagnose, easy to dismiss as stress or aging or just bad luck. You're watching a farmer inspect his crop and he's smiling. This wheat is going to yield 40 bushels per acre, maybe 50 if the weather holds. That's double what his father got from the same field 20 years ago. He can feed more people, make more money, expand his operation. He's not thinking about chromosome counts or protein structures or immune responses. He's thinking about yield, about profit, about progress. And from his perspective, from the perspective of agricultural science in 1961, this is progress. Unambiguous, uncomplicated, obvious progress. More food from less land. What could be wrong with that? But here's what nobody is considering. Medieval wheat, heritage wheat, ancient wheat. It had evolved alongside humans for 10,000 years. The digestive relationship between humans and wheat had been refined over hundreds of generations. Our bodies learned to process those specific proteins, those specific starches, those specific compounds. We co-evolved, in a sense. And then in the span of a single decade, we changed the wheat, fundamentally, dramatically, at a genetic level. And we expected our bodies to adapt instantly, to handle these new proteins, these new structures, these new compounds, without any adjustment period, without any consideration of whether our digestive systems could keep up with the pace of change. The wheat itself is just the beginning. Once you've got high-yield varieties, you need to support them with inputs, synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, applied in amounts that would astonish a medieval farmer, pesticides to kill the insects that want to eat the crop, herbicides to kill the weeds that compete for water and nutrients, and later in the 1980s and 1990s, the practice of pre-harvest desiccation, spraying the wheat with glyphosate a week before harvest to kill the plant and dry it out faster, to make harvesting more uniform and efficient. Never mind that glyphosate residue ends up in the grain. Never mind that glyphosate disrupts gut bacteria, the same beneficial bacteria that help you digest food and regulate your immune system. Never mind any of that. The wheat dries faster, the harvest is more efficient, the yield is higher. That's what matters. You're standing in this field in 1961, and you're looking at the future. A future where bread is cheap and abundant and available everywhere. A future where nobody goes hungry, at least not in wealthy countries. A future where wheat production has tripled, quadrupled, grown to levels that would seem impossible to someone from medieval times. But you're also looking at a future where the bread that feeds billions is fundamentally different from the bread that fed civilizations for thousands of years, different at a molecular level, different in ways that matter, different in ways that will reveal themselves slowly over decades as metabolic disease and autoimmune disorders and chronic inflammation become epidemic. The farmer walks away, satisfied with his crop, and you're left standing in this field of uniform, knee-high wheat, and you're wondering when exactly the switch happened. When did feeding people stop being about nourishment and start being about yield? When did we decide that producing more grain was worth changing the grain itself? And why did nobody ask whether our bodies could handle the change? You're in a massive industrial mill now, somewhere in the American Midwest, and the scale of everything is overwhelming. This isn't a riverside building with a water wheel and 2 millstones. This is a factory, 5 stories tall, covering an entire city block, filled with machinery that hums and clanks and roars. Grain comes in through one end, truckloads of it, and flour comes out the other end in 50-pound bags that stack up on pallets, thousands of bags per day, more flour than a medieval miller could produce in his entire lifetime, produced here in a single shift. The roller mills are the heart of the operation, rows of them, steel cylinders spinning at high speed, arranged in sequence. The wheat goes through the first set of rollers which crack the kernels open, then it's sifted through screens that separate the bran from the endosperm from the germ. The endosperm, the white starchy part, goes through more rollers that grind it finer and finer until it's almost powder, so fine it feels like silk when you run it through your fingers. The bran and germ, the parts that contain most of the nutrition, the fiber and vitamins and minerals and healthy fats, those get diverted into separate bins. They'll be sold as animal feed or used in health food products, marketed as wheat bran or wheat germ, sold back to health-conscious consumers who are trying to add back the nutrition that was removed in the first place. What's left is white flour, pure endosperm, pure starch with a damaged protein structure. The high-speed rollers generate heat, enough heat to destroy the delicate oils that would have been in the wheat germ if the wheat germ hadn't been removed. The vitamins break down, the enzymes denature. What you're left with is a nutritionally dead powder that will stay shelf-stable for months, even years, because there's nothing left in it that can go rancid or spoil. It's like a mummy, preserved through the removal of everything that was once alive. But wait, there's more. The flour isn't white enough yet, not by modern standards, so it goes through a bleaching process. Chlorine gas or benzol peroxide, chemicals that react with the natural pigments in the flour to make it whiter, brighter, more appealing to consumers who have been trained to associate whiteness with purity and quality. Never mind that these bleaching agents leave residues in the flour. Never mind that chlorine gas is toxic, that it's used as a chemical weapon, that exposing food to it seems like maybe not the best idea. It makes the flour white. It makes it sell better. That's what matters. Then comes enrichment, the process of adding back a tiny fraction of the nutrients that were destroyed during milling and bleaching. Synthetic vitamins mostly. Thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, iron. They're required by law actually, because by the 1940s it had become obvious that people eating nothing but white flour were developing deficiency diseases. Beriberi, pellagra, anemia. So the government mandated enrichment, and the flour companies complied, adding back maybe 20% of what was removed, calling it enriched flour, marketing it as nutritious, as improved, as modern and scientific, and better than the old-fashioned whole wheat flour your grandmother used. You're watching bags of this flour roll off the production line, and you're trying to imagine what Thomas the medieval baker would think if he could see this. The sheer volume would astound him, the speed, the efficiency, the scale of production. It would seem like magic or madness or both. But would he recognize this powder as flour? Would he understand that this white, soft, slightly chemical-smelling substance came from wheat? Would he try to make bread with it and wonder why it behaved so differently, why it mixed differently, rose differently, baked differently, tasted differently? And here's the thing that really matters, the thing that connects all of this back to your health, to your body, to why bread makes you feel terrible now when it's sustained humans for millennia. This flour, this enriched, bleached, roller-milled powder, it's not food anymore, not really. It's been processed so heavily, altered so fundamentally, stripped and bleached and chemically treated to such an extent that your body barely recognizes it as something edible. When you eat bread made from this flour, your blood sugar spikes immediately because there's no fiber to slow down digestion, no healthy fats to provide sustained energy, nothing but pure starch that your body converts to glucose almost instantly. Your pancreas dumps insulin to handle the surge. The glucose gets stored as fat. Your blood sugar crashes. You feel hungry again an hour later. You eat more bread. The cycle repeats. Over months and years, this pattern leads to insulin resistance. Your cells stop responding to insulin properly because they're being flooded with it constantly. Your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to achieve the same effect. Eventually, you develop type 2 diabetes, or metabolic syndrome, or obesity, or all three because they're all related, all caused by the same underlying problem, which is that you're eating food that your body can't process properly, food that triggers hormonal chaos, food that was designed for shelf stability and profit margins rather than human health. The mill keeps running, producing thousands of pounds of flour per hour, and somewhere downstream bakeries are using this flour to make bread that will be sold in grocery stores wrapped in plastic, labelled with ingredient lists that read like chemistry experiments. And people will buy it because it's cheap and convenient, and they don't know any better. They don't know that bread used to be different, that it used to be made differently, that it used to nourish instead of harm. They just know that eating bread makes them feel bad, and they assume it's their fault, that they're gluten intolerant or sensitive or broken somehow. When really, it's the bread that's broken. The bread that stopped being bread somewhere between the medieval bakery and the industrial mill, somewhere between stone grinding and steel rollers, somewhere between patient fermentation and chemical leavening, somewhere between food and product. You're in a supermarket bakery now, the kind that's built into the back corner of a grocery store, and it's 4 a.m. A worker in a white apron is pulling frozen dough out of a cardboard box. Not frozen loaves, frozen dough, shipped from a central factory somewhere, probably hundreds of miles away, maybe even from another country. The dough is pale, almost grey, formed into uniform cylinders wrapped in plastic. He unwraps them and places them on metal trays, then slides the trays into a proofing cabinet, a heated box that will thaw the dough and make it rise over the next few hours. By the time the store opens at 7, these will be baked, and they'll smell amazing, and customers will think they're buying fresh bread, bakery bread, real bread. And in a technical sense they are. The bread was baked today, in this building, in an oven. But calling this fresh is like calling a TV dinner homemade because you heated it in your own microwave. The dough was mixed days ago, maybe weeks ago, in an industrial facility you'll never see. Giant mixers, each one holding hundreds of pounds of ingredients. Flour, water, yeast, sugar, salt. But also soybean oil, dough conditioners, emulsifiers, preservatives, enzymes, ascorbic acid, calcium propionate, datum, sodium stearoyl lactylate, chemicals you can't pronounce, chemicals whose purpose you don't understand, chemicals that exist solely to make the dough behave consistently, rise predictably, stay soft for weeks, resist mold, maintain texture, survive freezing and thawing without falling apart. This dough was mixed for 12 minutes, not 12 hours. It was given a brief rise, maybe an hour, then formed into shapes, frozen and shipped. No fermentation, no bacteria breaking down anti-nutrients, no wild yeast transforming the flour, just raw gluten proteins and starch and chemicals, frozen in time, waiting to be baked. You're watching the worker now as he brushes the risen dough with egg wash to give it a golden colour, and you're thinking about what fermentation actually does, about why it matters, about what's missing from this bread even though it will look perfect and smell wonderful and sell well. When dough ferments properly, really ferments over 12 or 24 hours, the bacteria produce organic acids, lactic acid, acetic acid. These acids lower the pH of the dough, and that acidic environment activates enzymes called phytases that break down phytic acid. Phytic acid is a storage form of phosphorus that plants use, and in your body it binds to minerals like iron, zinc, calcium, magnesium. It grabs onto them and prevents you from absorbing them. It's an anti-nutrient, literally a compound that blocks nutrition. Long fermentation neutralizes it. Short fermentation doesn't. So even if this supermarket bread was made with whole wheat flour, even if it contained all the minerals that were in the original grain, your body couldn't access them because the phytic acid is still there, still active, still binding to everything valuable. Then there's the gluten itself. When bacteria and wild yeast ferment dough, they produce enzymes called proteases that partially break down gluten proteins. They snip the long chains into shorter fragments, fragments your digestive enzymes can actually handle. This is why people with mild gluten sensitivity can often eat sourdough bread without problems. The gluten has been pre-digested. It's been partially dismantled before it ever reaches your gut. But this frozen dough mixed and risen in under 2 hours before freezing, the gluten is intact, completely intact. And modern wheat gluten, remember, is already harder to digest than ancient wheat gluten because of all those genetic changes. So you're getting the most difficult to digest version of gluten, prepared in the least digestive-friendly way possible. It's almost designed to cause problems. The bread is baking now, and the smell is filling the store, warm and yeasty and inviting, triggering associations in your brain, memories of comfort and home and safety. Smell is powerful that way. It bypasses your rational mind and goes straight to emotion. You smell baking bread and you feel good, even if the bread itself is nutritionally bankrupt, even if eating it will spike your blood sugar and leave you hungry and inflame your gut. Marketing departments know this. They know that pumping the smell of baking bread through a store increases sales across all departments, not just the bakery. It makes people feel happy, nostalgic, generous. It makes them buy more stuff. The worker pulls the loaves out of the oven and places them in the display case, and within minutes customers are buying them. A woman picks up a loaf of what's labelled as whole wheat bread, and she feels virtuous, like she's making a healthy choice, like she's doing something good for her family. She doesn't know that whole wheat just means they left some of the bran in the flour, that it's still refined and processed and made from modern high-yield wheat, and mixed with dough conditioners and preservatives. She doesn't know that the fibre content, while higher than white bread, is still a fraction of what stone-ground whole-grain flour would provide. She doesn't know that the brown colour comes partly from molasses or caramel colouring added to make it look healthier. She just knows it says whole wheat on the label, and whole wheat is supposed to be good for you, so she buys it. Another customer is buying a French baguette, and he's thinking about how authentic it looks, how European, how artisanal. The crust is crispy, the interior is white with those characteristic irregular holes. It looks like real bread, the kind you'd buy from a boulangerie in Paris, except it's made from the same industrial flour, mixed with the same dough conditioners, frozen and shipped and baked on site, just like everything else. It's a performance of authenticity, a simulation of traditional bread making, designed to trigger your associations with real bread while delivering none of the benefits. You're sitting in a laboratory now at a university somewhere, watching a researcher explain her findings, and what she's telling you should be front-page news but somehow isn't. She's been studying the difference between bread made from heritage wheat, using traditional methods, and bread made from modern wheat, using industrial processes. Same people, eating the same amount of bread, just different types. The results are stark enough that you can't believe this isn't talked about more, can't believe this isn't common knowledge, can't believe the food industry has managed to keep this quiet for so long. The people eating heritage wheat bread, einkorn specifically, stone ground and fermented for 24 hours, they showed significantly lower blood glucose responses after meals, not slightly lower, significantly lower. Their blood sugar rose more slowly, peaked lower, and came back down more gradually. Their insulin response was proportionally lower. Over time, eating this bread didn't trigger the same hormonal chaos, the same insulin resistance, the same metabolic stress. And these weren't people with diabetes or pre-diabetes. These were healthy adults. The difference was just the bread. But it gets better. The people with irritable bowel syndrome, the ones who had spent years avoiding bread because it made them feel terrible, bloated and cramping and miserable, 80% of them could eat the heritage wheat bread without symptoms. 80%. That's not a small improvement. That's not a marginal difference. That's the difference between being able to eat bread and not being able to eat bread. Between thinking you have a permanent condition and realizing you were just reacting to an industrial food product designed poorly. The researcher is explaining that the gluten structure in einkorn is fundamentally different, that the gliadin proteins are arranged in ways that don't trigger the same immune responses, that the human digestive system recognizes this as food rather than as a foreign invader. And then there's the inflammatory marker data, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, all these compounds that indicate inflammation in your body. They were significantly lower in the people eating heritage wheat bread compared to the people eating modern wheat bread. Same calories, same macronutrient profile, same amount of gluten technically, but completely different inflammatory responses. Because the wheat itself is different, and the preparation method is different, and your body knows the difference even if your conscious mind doesn't. You're looking at graphs now, data visualizations that show the metabolic differences, and you're thinking about how this should change everything, how this should lead to massive public health campaigns, to changes in agricultural policy, to subsidies for heritage wheat farmers and traditional bakers, how this should be taught in medical schools and nutrition programs, how every doctor treating patients for metabolic syndrome or autoimmune disorders or chronic inflammation should know about this, should be asking about bread consumption, should be recommending heritage wheat and traditional preparation methods. But it's not happening. The research exists, buried in academic journals that most people will never read. The data is clear, but it's not reaching the public because there's no profit motive in telling people that the solution to their health problems might be eating less processed food. There's no pharmaceutical company that benefits from you eating better bread. There's no industrial food conglomerate that wants you to know that their product is causing inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. The economic incentives all point in the wrong direction, toward more processing, more additives, more convenience, more profit margin, not toward health. The researcher is talking about another study now, one that examined gluten content in wheat over the past century. And yes, modern wheat does contain more gluten than heritage varieties, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is the type of gluten, the specific proteins, the way they're structured at a molecular level. Ancient einkorn has weak gluten, yes, but it also has gliadin proteins that are fundamentally different from modern gliadin. When your immune system encounters ancient gliadin, it doesn't react. When it encounters modern gliadin, particularly the 33-mer peptide fragment that's resistant to digestive enzymes, it freaks out. It triggers an inflammatory response. And if you're eating modern wheat bread 3 times a day, every day, for years, that chronic low-grade inflammation never stops. It just builds and builds, damaging your gut lining, stressing your immune system, contributing to all the modern diseases that seem mysterious until you realize they all share inflammation as a root cause. You're watching the researcher handle samples of flour, one from heritage wheat, one from modern wheat, and even though they both came from wheat, they look different. The heritage flour is coarser, darker, more varied in texture. The modern flour is fine, uniform, almost sterile looking. And you're thinking about how appropriate that is, how the visual difference reflects the biochemical difference, how you can literally see that something has been removed, refined away, processed out of existence. The modern flour looks clean and pure and perfect, but it's been purified of everything that made it valuable, everything that made it nourishing, everything that allowed humans to thrive on wheat for 10,000 years. The lab visit is ending, and the researcher is talking about how hard it is to get funding for this kind of research, how the agricultural industry isn't interested, how the food industry actively opposes it, how even getting the heritage wheat to study is difficult because so few farmers grow it anymore. She's frustrated, you can tell. She's discovered something important, something that could help millions of people, and nobody with power or money seems to care. The system isn't designed to optimize for health, it's designed to optimize for profit, and those two goals, health and profit, they don't align as often as you'd hope. You're back in medieval times, but now you're in a monastery somewhere in Germany, maybe Bavaria, and it's winter. Snow covers the ground outside, piled up against the stone walls, and inside the bakery attached to the monastery kitchen, a monk named Brother Heinrich is working. Monasteries were centers of learning, of preservation, of careful record-keeping, and that extended to bread making. The monks kept detailed notes about their processes, about what worked and what didn't, about how different grains behaved, about fermentation times and oven temperatures. They were the scientists of their age, in a way, experimenting and documenting and passing knowledge down through generations of brothers who took their vows and learned the work. Brother Heinrich is mixing dough for the week's bread. The monastery houses 40 monks, plus another 20 lay workers and servants, plus whatever travelers and pilgrims show up at the gate looking for shelter. They'll go through maybe 100 loaves this week, possibly more if the weather stays bad and people can't travel. He's using spelt, a heritage wheat variety that grows well in this region, that tolerates the cold winters and produces reliable yields even in poor soil. The grain was harvested back in August, threshed and stored in the monastery granary, a stone building kept dry and cool, protected from rats and moisture. It was milled yesterday at the monastery's own mill, ground between stones that have been in use for 60 years, turned by a stream that flows down from the mountains and never freezes completely, even in the deepest winter. The flour is coarse, grey-brown, flecked with dark bits of bran. Brother Heinrich adds water from the monastery well, cold and clean, flavoured slightly with minerals from the rock it flows through. He adds salt, expensive salt that came from the coast, carried inland by merchants, worth its weight in silver, and he adds starter culture from the crock that sits near the hearth, the same starter culture that's been maintained by the monastery's bakers for generations, fed and refreshed, kept alive like a living thing, because that's essentially what it is. A colony of yeast and bacteria adapted to this flour, this water, this environment, producing bread that tastes distinctly of this place, this monastery, this tradition. He kneads the dough briefly, just enough to bring it together, and then he lets it rest. This is important, this rest period. Brother Heinrich learned this from the previous baker, Brother Otto, who learned it from his predecessor. If you knead too much, the bread becomes tough. If you don't knead enough, it doesn't develop structure. But if you knead briefly and then let the dough rest, let the water hydrate the flour fully, let the gluten relax, you get better bread. The monks don't understand gluten or hydration or protein structure, they just know what works. They've refined this process through decades of daily bread making, through thousands of loaves, through careful observation and adjustment. The dough will sit for 24 hours before baking. In that time, the wild yeast will make it rise, slowly, while the bacteria produce acids that give it flavour and make it more digestible. Brother Heinrich covers the trough with a cloth and leaves it in a cool corner of the bakery. Tomorrow at this time he'll shape the loaves and bake them, and the monastery will have bread for the week. This is the rhythm of monastic life. Prayer, work, bread. The same routines repeated day after day, year after year, creating a kind of stability, a kind of continuity that feels almost alien to modern sensibility, where everything moves fast, where nothing stays the same for long, where last year's phone is already obsolete. You're noticing something about Brother Heinrich's hands. They're strong, scarred from years of work, but they're not inflamed or swollen. He's been eating bread every day of his life since childhood. Bread for breakfast with ale, bread for lunch with soup or cheese, bread for dinner with whatever vegetables the monastery garden produces. He's probably eating 3 pounds of bread a day, maybe more during winter when other food is scarce. And he's healthy. Not thriving in the modern sense maybe, because he's living in a drafty stone building in the dead of winter with no central heating and no modern medicine. But he's not sick from the bread, he's not diabetic, he's not dealing with autoimmune disorders or chronic inflammation or metabolic syndrome. The bread is sustaining him, giving him the energy to work long hours in the cold, to pray through the night offices, to maintain the physical labour that monastic life requires. And here's something interesting that the monastery records reveal. The monks are living longer than the general population, not dramatically longer, but noticeably longer. Part of this is diet. They eat regularly, reliably, predictably. They're not subject to the feast and famine cycle that affects peasants whose food supply depends on harvest success. They eat bread and vegetables and occasional fish, rarely meat except on feast days. It's a simple diet, monotonous by modern standards, but it's adequate. It's nourishing. It's keeping them alive and functional into their 50s and 60s, old age by medieval standards. And the foundation of that diet is bread. Good bread. Bread made with care and patience and knowledge accumulated over generations. Brother Heinrich is checking his starter now, stirring it, smelling it. It has a sharp, tangy odour, almost like yogurt or beer, and he nods with satisfaction. The culture is healthy, active, ready to leaven tomorrow's dough. This starter is older than he is, older than anyone currently living in the monastery. It was begun decades ago, possibly a century ago, and it's been maintained continuously ever since. Fed every few days with fresh flour and water, kept warm but not hot, protected from contamination. It's a living link to the past, to all the monks who baked before, to all the bread that sustained this community through wars and plagues and famines, and it produces bread that people can actually digest, actually thrive on, actually live on for their entire lives without getting sick. You're thinking about your sourdough starter at home, the one you started during lockdown and then abandoned after a few weeks because maintaining it felt like too much work, because the bread didn't rise quite right, because store-bought was easier. You're in a corporate boardroom now, and the year is 1985, and a group of food scientists and executives are discussing a problem. Bread is getting cheaper to produce, which is good for profit margins, but it's also getting worse, which is bad for sales. Consumers are complaining that the bread goes stale too quickly, that it tastes bland, that it doesn't stay soft. The industrial bread-making process, the Corleywood method developed in Britain in the 1960s and now spreading worldwide, has cut production time from hours to minutes. You can mix flour, water, yeast and a cocktail of additives in a high-speed mixer, work the dough intensively for 3 minutes, let it rise for an hour, and bake. No bulk fermentation, no flavor development, no time for bacteria to do anything useful, just speed and efficiency and cost reduction. But the bread that results from this process is inferior in ways even non-experts can detect. It goes stale within a day, the texture is cottony, almost squeaky, the flavor is non-existent, just a vague wheaty blandness that needs to be masked with sugar or other additives. So the food scientists are proposing solutions, not better flour or longer fermentation or traditional methods, because those would cost more and take longer and reduce profit margins. Instead, they're proposing chemicals, dough conditioners to replace the gluten development that would normally happen during long fermentation, emulsifiers to keep the bread soft even as it ages, preservatives to prevent mold for weeks instead of days, enzymes to improve texture and volume, ascorbic acid to strengthen the dough, calcium propionate to inhibit bacterial growth. One executive is asking about consumer perception, about whether people will object to all these additives, and a food scientist is reassuring him, the ingredients will be listed on the label, yes, as required by law, but they'll be listed by their technical names, which most consumers won't recognize or understand. Calcium propionate sounds scientific, technical, not like a chemical you're adding to prevent mold. Sodium stearoyl lactylate sounds complex, which implies sophistication rather than adulteration. Most people won't read the ingredient list anyway. They'll look at the price, maybe the nutrition facts, and that's it. And for the few who do read ingredients and object, well, there's no alternative anymore. The small local bakeries are closing, traditional bread making is dying out, industrial bread is becoming the only bread, which means consumers don't have a choice. They can buy this bread or they can not eat bread. And people need bread. People have been eating bread for thousands of years. They're not going to stop now. Another executive is bringing up health concerns. There are reports, scattered studies, suggesting that some of these additives might cause problems, allergic reactions, digestive issues, possible long-term health effects that aren't fully understood. But the scientists are dismissive. The doses are small, the additives are approved by regulators, there's no definitive proof of harm, and absence of proof is being treated as proof of absence. Besides, the alternative is going back to traditional methods, which would make bread more expensive, which would reduce consumption, which would hurt profits. So the decision is made, the additives stay, the process continues. The bread gets worse, but it gets cheaper and more convenient. And in the marketplace of 1985, in the world of two-income households and microwaves and TV dinners, convenience is king. You're watching this meeting, and you're thinking about how many decisions like this have been made over the decades, how many times convenience and profit have won out over quality and health, how the cumulative effect of thousands of small compromises has created a food system that's fundamentally broken. No single decision doomed bread. It was a process, a gradual degradation, a slow slide from real food to industrial product, the shift from stone milling to roller milling, the development of high-yield wheat varieties, the introduction of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, the move to rapid mixing and short fermentation, the addition of preservatives and dough conditioners. Each change seemed reasonable at the time, defensible, justifiable, and taken individually, maybe they were, but the cumulative effect, the compounding impact of all these changes together, that's what destroyed bread. The meeting is ending, and the executives are satisfied. They've solved the problem, or at least addressed the symptoms. The bread will stay soft longer, it will resist mold, it will look appealing on the shelf, it will sell. And if people start getting sick, if rates of diabetes and obesity and autoimmune disease start climbing, well, that's not the bread's fault, that's sedentary lifestyles, that's too much sugar, that's lack of exercise, that's genetic predisposition, that's anything and everything except the fundamental change in the bread itself, the transformation from food into product, from nourishment into empty calories wrapped in marketing. You're back in the present now, standing in a grocery store aisle, looking at dozens of bread options, whole wheat, white, multigrain, Italian, French, sourdough that isn't actually sourdough, artisan that isn't actually artisan. Every loaf wrapped in plastic, printed with health claims and marketing language, designed to look appealing, to seem nutritious, to promise benefits it can't deliver. You pick up a loaf labeled as artisan sourdough, and you read the ingredients, enriched flour, water, salt, yeast, and there, buried in the middle of the list, sorbic acid, cultured wheat flour, enzymes, ascorbic acid. This isn't sourdough, this is industrial bread with sourdough flavoring, made to taste like the real thing without the time and cost of actual fermentation. You put it back and pick up another loaf, this one labeled simply as whole wheat. Better maybe. You read the ingredients. Whole wheat flour, water, high fructose corn syrup, soybean oil, salt, yeast, wheat gluten, preservatives, dough conditioners. So many additives, so many things that aren't flour or water or salt. You're starting to understand that finding real bread in this store might actually be impossible, that the entire section might be filled with variations on the same industrial product, dressed up in different packaging, marketed with different claims, but fundamentally the same. Refined flour, rapid processing, chemical additives, designed for profit rather than nourishment. You're in a kitchen in 2025, your kitchen maybe, and you're looking at a bag of all-purpose flour. The label says enriched, which sounds good, sounds like the flour has been improved somehow, enhanced, made better than it was before. You open the bag and the flour puffs out in a small cloud, perfectly white, so fine it's almost weightless. You pour some into a bowl and it looks like snow, feels like powder, completely uniform. There are no variations in color, no flecks of bran, no hint that this came from a plant, from a living thing that grew in soil under the sun. It looks processed because it is processed, stripped and refined and bleached and enriched, and you're about to make bread with it because you don't know any better, because this is what flour looks like in your experience, because the alternative isn't available at your grocery store. You follow a recipe you found online. Quick bread, no need, ready in 3 hours. You mix the flour with water, instant yeast from a jar, sugar to feed the yeast, salt, maybe some oil. You stir it together, and the dough comes together easily, smoothly, more like batter than the dough you'd imagine medieval bakers working with. It's wet, sticky, loose. You let it rise for an hour, covered with plastic wrap. When you come back it's expanded, bubbled up with carbon dioxide from the yeast, and you punch it down, shape it roughly, and put it in a loaf pan. Another hour of rising, then into the oven. The bread bakes, and the smell fills your kitchen, and it does smell good, genuinely good, in that primal way that baking bread has smelled good to humans for thousands of years. Your brain responds to that smell with pleasure, with anticipation, with associations of warmth and comfort and home. The bread comes out golden, at least on top, and you let it cool before slicing. The interior is white, soft, with a tight, even crumb. Small uniform holes, nothing like the irregular wild structure of traditionally fermented bread. You spread butter on a slice and taste it. It's fine. Not amazing, not terrible, just fine. It tastes mostly like the butter, with a background note of generic bread flavor. It's soft, easy to chew, easy to swallow. And an hour later you're hungry again. Not just peckish, actually hungry, like you didn't just eat. Your blood sugar spiked hard when you ate that bread, all that refined starch hitting your system at once, and your pancreas responded with a massive insulin dump, and now your blood sugar has crashed below where it started, and your body is demanding more food to compensate. This is the cycle. This is what modern bread does. It doesn't satisfy. It triggers cravings. It creates a hormonal roller coaster that makes you eat more often, always chasing satiety that never quite arrives. But you don't make the connection. You just think you're still hungry, that maybe you didn't eat enough, that you should have had 2 slices instead of 1. You don't realize that medieval peasants eating their dense, sour whole grain bread stayed full for hours, because the bread released energy slowly, because the fiber and healthy fats slowed digestion, because the fermentation had transformed the flour into something your body could actually process efficiently. You just know that your homemade bread, the bread you took 3 hours to make, the bread that smelled so good baking, it didn't really satisfy you, and you assume that's normal, that's just how bread is. Except it's not, or it wasn't, not for thousands of years, not until very recently in the grand scheme of human history. The bread you just made and ate, it would be unrecognizable to someone from medieval times, not just in appearance but in how it behaves in your body. They would eat their bread and work for 12 hours. You eat yours and you're hungry an hour later. They would eat bread for 70% of their calories and stay lean and healthy. You eat bread a few times a week and struggle with weight and blood sugar and inflammation. The difference isn't your metabolism or your genetics or your willpower. The difference is the bread. You're looking at the remainder of the loaf now and you're thinking about storing it. It'll be fine for a day, maybe 2, and then it'll start to go stale, dry out, harden. By day 4 it'll be rock solid unless you keep it in plastic, which will keep it soft but also make it susceptible to mold. Medieval bread stayed edible for a week because the fermentation produced organic acids that inhibit mold growth naturally. Your bread needs plastic wrap and preservatives to last even half that long, but you don't think about this. You just wrap it in plastic and put it in the bread box and move on with your day. Later that evening you're scrolling through social media, and you see an article about gluten sensitivity, about how millions of people are cutting gluten out of their diets, about the explosion of gluten-free products in grocery stores. The article mentions celiac disease, mentions non-celiac gluten sensitivity, mentions inflammation and digestive problems and brain fog, and you think maybe that's you, maybe you're gluten sensitive. It would explain why bread never quite satisfies, why you sometimes feel bloated after eating it, why your energy crashes. You start thinking about going gluten-free, about buying those expensive gluten-free breads and pastas and crackers, about eliminating wheat entirely from your diet. But here's what the article doesn't tell you, what nobody tells you because the information is buried in academic journals and historical records that most people never see. The problem might not be gluten. The problem might be modern wheat and modern processing. The problem might be that you're eating bread that's fundamentally different from the bread humans evolved eating, bread that's been optimized for everything except digestibility and nutrition. And the solution might not be eliminating bread entirely. It might be finding real bread, or making real bread, or demanding that the food industry produce real bread instead of the industrial simulacrum that's taken over. You're on a farm now, a small farm in Vermont or Oregon or somewhere else where people are trying to do things differently, and you're watching a farmer harvest wheat by hand. Not because he's making some kind of artistic statement or because he's historically reenacting medieval agriculture. He's doing it by hand because his field is small, maybe 2 acres, and a combine harvester would cost more than his entire annual revenue. He's growing einkorn, the ancient wheat, because there's a market for it among people who are discovering they can eat this wheat even though modern wheat makes them sick. His customers are willing to pay a premium 3 or 4 times what commodity wheat sells for, because for them this isn't just wheat, this is the difference between being able to eat bread and not being able to eat bread. The harvest is slow, back-breaking work, just like it was in medieval times. He cuts the stalks with a scythe, binds them into sheaves, stands them up in shocks to dry. It takes days to harvest 2 acres, work that a combine could do in an hour, but the combine would also shatter some of the grain, mix in debris, require chemicals and infrastructure, and scale that don't exist on a farm this small. Hand harvesting means every stalk is cut at the right time. Every kernel makes it from field to storage clean and intact. It's inefficient by industrial standards, but it produces better grain, purer grain. Grain that hasn't been damaged or contaminated or mixed with 20 other varieties in a grain elevator somewhere. After harvest, the wheat goes to a small mill 20 miles away, the only stone mill still operating in the region. The miller, a man in his 60s who learned the trade from his father, grinds the einkorn slowly, carefully, producing flour that stays cool enough not to damage the nutrients. He bags it in 2-pound quantities and sells it the same week. No long-term storage, no warehouses full of flour slowly oxidizing and going rancid. Fresh flour, milled on demand, used immediately. This is how flour was always handled before refrigeration and preservatives, and it turns out it's still the best way if you want flour that's actually nutritious. The farmer sells his einkorn flour at farmers' markets online to a handful of local bakeries that specialize in traditional bread. He makes a living, barely, enough to keep the farm going, enough to justify the work. But he's not getting rich, there's no economy of scale here. No way to compete on price with industrial wheat farming where a single farmer manages thousands of acres using GPS-guided equipment and produces wheat that sells for pennies per pound. His wheat costs $10 per pound of flour. Industrial wheat flour costs 50 cents per pound. The difference is quality, yes, but it's also labour, scale, efficiency. Real bread, bread made the old way from heritage wheat. It's expensive, it has to be. The economics don't work otherwise. You're talking to one of his customers now, a woman in her 40s who discovered einkorn after years of digestive problems. She tried eliminating gluten, went completely gluten-free for 2 years, felt better initially but then started having other problems, nutrient deficiencies, energy crashes, constant cravings for bread and pasta. She missed bread desperately. Not just the taste, but the satisfaction, the way it used to make her feel full and content. Someone suggested she try einkorn, and she was skeptical because wheat is wheat, right? Gluten is gluten. But she tried it anyway, baked a loaf from this farmer's flour using a long fermentation sourdough method, and she could eat it. No bloating, no pain, no digestive distress. She cried, actually cried, because she could eat bread again. She buys 10 pounds of flour a month now, bakes bread every week, maintains her own sourdough starter that she's named, and treats like a pet. She's learned that bread making doesn't have to be complicated, just slow. Mix flour, water and starter before bed. Let it ferment overnight, shape and bake in the morning. It fits into her life because she's made it fit, because having real bread again is worth the effort. And she's noticed other things changing. Her energy is more stable, her cravings have decreased. She's lost weight without trying, just from switching from industrial bread to real bread, from empty calories that spike blood sugar to complex nutrition that satisfies. But she's also aware of how privileged this solution is. She can afford $10 per pound flour. She has time to maintain a starter and bake weekly. She has access to a farmer growing heritage wheat and a miller producing fresh flour. Most people don't have these things. Most people are stuck with whatever's at their grocery store, with industrial bread or no bread, with prices that make organic and heritage and traditional completely inaccessible. The system isn't designed to make real bread available to everyone. It's designed to make cheap bread available to everyone. And there's a difference. A crucial difference that affects health in ways that compound over years and decades. The farmer is loading bags of flour into his truck, heading to the farmer's market, and you're thinking about how fragile this whole system is. One farmer, one mill, a handful of customers. If the farmer's back gives out, if the miller retires and nobody takes over, if regulations change or costs increase or the market shifts, this source of real wheat, real flour, real bread, it could disappear. And it's like this all over, small pockets of traditional food production hanging on by their fingernails, trying to preserve knowledge and practices that were once universal but are now endangered, threatened by industrial food systems that prioritize scale and efficiency over everything else. You're in a hospital now, in an endocrinologist's office, and a doctor is explaining to a patient why his blood sugar is out of control despite taking medication. The patient is 53, overweight but not obese, exercises occasionally, doesn't drink much, doesn't smoke. His A1C has been climbing steadily for 5 years and now he's officially diabetic, type 2, and the doctor is adjusting his medications, talking about insulin resistance and lifestyle changes. The patient is confused, frustrated. He thought he was eating healthy. He switched to whole wheat bread years ago. He avoids fried foods. He doesn't eat dessert every day. What's he doing wrong? The doctor asks about his typical meals and the patient describes breakfast, whole wheat toast with peanut butter, or cereal with milk, or a bagel. Lunch is usually a sandwich, whole wheat bread, turkey or chicken, maybe some vegetables. Dinner varies, but there's often bread involved. Dinner rolls or garlic bread, or bread on the side of pasta. Snacks are crackers, granola bars, pretzels. The doctor is nodding, making notes, and finally he says what the patient doesn't want to hear. It's the bread. It's the grain-based foods. They're all converting to glucose in your bloodstream, spiking your blood sugar multiple times per day, forcing your pancreas to produce insulin constantly. And over time your cells have stopped responding to insulin properly. You've developed insulin resistance, and now your blood sugar stays elevated. And that elevated blood sugar is damaging your blood vessels, your nerves, your kidneys, your eyes. The patient is defensive. But it's whole wheat. It's supposed to be healthy. The food pyramid says grains are the foundation of a healthy diet. Every nutritionist he's ever talked to has said whole grains are good for you. The doctor sighs. The food pyramid was created in the 1970s based on incomplete science and industry lobbying, he explains. The recommendations have been updated since then, but the cultural belief that bread is inherently healthy has persisted. Whole wheat is better than white bread, yes, marginally, but it still spikes blood sugar. It still triggers insulin release. It still contributes to insulin resistance if you're eating it multiple times per day, every day, for years. The patient asks what he's supposed to eat then, and the doctor starts talking about protein, healthy fats, vegetables, reducing overall carbohydrate intake, especially refined carbohydrates and grain-based foods. The patient is thinking about his Italian grandmother who ate bread with every meal and lived to 92. Why was bread fine for her but not for him? The doctor doesn't have a good answer for this, or rather, he has an answer but it's complicated and most patients don't want to hear about agricultural history and wheat genetics and fermentation chemistry. He just says that bread has changed, that the bread your grandmother ate was different and leaves it at that. But you know better now. You know exactly why bread was fine for the grandmother but not for the grandson. She grew up eating bread made from different wheat, milled differently, prepared differently. She probably grew up in Italy or in an Italian-American community where traditional bread making persisted longer than it did in mainstream American culture. She ate bread that was fermented properly, that didn't spike blood sugar as dramatically, that contained more fiber and nutrients, that wasn't loaded with preservatives and dough conditioners. And even if she did eventually eat modern industrial bread, she ate it for fewer years of her life. The grandson has been eating industrial bread since childhood, every day, multiple times per day, for 53 years. The cumulative damage is different. The doctor is prescribing metformin now, a medication that helps control blood sugar by making cells more sensitive to insulin and reducing glucose production in the liver. It's a good medication, relatively safe, been around for decades, but it's treating the symptom, not the cause. The cause is the diet, specifically the constant consumption of foods that spike blood sugar, and until that changes, the medications can only do so much. The patient will probably need increasing doses over time, maybe additional medications, maybe eventually insulin injections. This is the progression of type 2 diabetes in most patients. Slow, steady, inevitable, unless something fundamental changes in the diet. You're sitting in the waiting room now, watching other patients come and go. Most of them are overweight, many are obese, some are using canes or walkers, some have visible signs of diabetic complications, neuropathy, poor wound healing, vision problems. This is one endocrinologist in one hospital in one city, and the waiting room is full. Multiply this by every hospital in every city in the country, and you start to understand the scale of the metabolic disease epidemic. Type 2 diabetes affects 37 million Americans, over 11% of the population. Another 96 million are pre-diabetic, and most of them don't know it yet. That's 1 in 3 adults walking around with blood sugar levels that are higher than they should be, with insulin resistance building silently, with metabolic dysfunction that will eventually progress to full diabetes unless something changes. And bread is a major contributor. Not the only contributor, obviously. Sugar, processed foods, sedentary lifestyles, stress, sleep deprivation, all of these play roles. But bread is insidious because it's been marketed as healthy, as wholesome, as something you should eat every day. People think they're making good choices by choosing whole wheat over white, by avoiding obvious junk food, by following the nutritional guidelines they learned in school. They don't realize that the guidelines were wrong, that whole wheat bread still spikes blood sugar dramatically. that eating bread multiple times per day is a recipe for metabolic disaster when that bread is made from modern wheat using industrial methods. The patient is leaving the office now, prescription in hand, and he looks defeated. He's facing a future of medication management, blood sugar monitoring, dietary restrictions, potential complications, and nobody has told him about heritage wheat or traditional fermentation, or the possibility that real bread, properly made, might not cause these problems. Nobody has told him that his body isn't broken, that he's not weak or undisciplined or genetically cursed. He's just been eating food that his body can't handle, food that humans weren't designed to eat in the quantities and frequencies that modern life demands. You're in a grocery store in 1955, and the bread aisle looks completely different from what you're used to. There are fewer options, for one thing. Maybe a dozen varieties instead of 50. White bread, whole wheat, rye, maybe pumpernickel. Most of it is industrial bread, yes, made with roller-milled flour and relatively quick processes, but the ingredient lists are shorter. Flour, water, yeast, salt, maybe some milk or butter, maybe a preservative or two. The wheat itself is still mostly traditional varieties, not yet fully replaced by the semi-dwarf high-yield strains. The bread isn't great by medieval standards, but it's not as bad as what comes later. A housewife is shopping, putting a loaf of white bread in her cart. She's feeding a family of 5 on one income, and bread is cheap, filling, convenient. Her children eat it for lunch, sandwiches with bologna or peanut butter. They eat it for breakfast, toast with butter and jam, sometimes for dinner, alongside meatloaf or pot roast. It's a significant portion of their diet, maybe 30 or 40% of their calories, and they're mostly fine. Obesity rates in 1955 are under 10%. Type 2 diabetes is rare enough that most people never encounter it. The metabolic disease epidemic hasn't started yet. Not really, not at the scale it will reach in coming decades. But the seeds are being planted, the agricultural changes are underway. Norman Borlaug is already developing his semi-dwarf wheat. Chemical companies are promoting synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Food scientists are experimenting with additives and preservatives and new processing methods. The Corleywood process is a few years away from being developed. The transformation of bread from food to product is accelerating, and nobody is asking whether this is a good idea, whether these changes might have consequences, whether optimizing for yield and shelf life and profit might compromise nutrition and digestibility and health. You fast forward to 1975, and the bread aisle is expanded. More varieties, more brands, more options. Low-calorie bread, high-fiber bread, protein-enriched bread. The ingredient lists are getting longer. More preservatives, more dough conditioners, more additives with chemical names. The wheat itself has changed, almost completely replaced now by modern high-yield varieties. The bread is softer, whiter, stays fresh longer, but it's also more processed, further removed from anything that could be called traditional bread. And the health statistics are starting to shift. Obesity rates are climbing, now over 15%. Type 2 diabetes is becoming more common, though still not at epidemic levels. Fast forward again to 1995. The bread aisle is enormous now. Dozens of options, every possible variation. Artisan-style bread that isn't actually artisan. Sourdough that isn't actually sourdough. Organic bread that's still made with modern wheat and quick processes. The health statistics are alarming. Obesity rates are approaching 30%. Type 2 diabetes is affecting millions. Celiac disease diagnoses are increasing rapidly, and more people are reporting gluten sensitivity, digestive problems, symptoms that didn't exist or weren't recognized a generation ago. And here in 2025, the bread aisle is a monument to industrial food production. Every loaf wrapped in plastic, printed with health claims, marketed with images of wheat fields and farmhouses and tradition, none of it true, all of it simulation. The obesity rate is over 40%. Type 2 diabetes affects more than 1 in 10 adults. Celiac disease has increased fourfold since the 1950s. Millions more suffer from non-celiac gluten sensitivity, from irritable bowel syndrome, from inflammatory bowel disease, from autoimmune conditions that were rare or unknown 70 years ago. You're standing in this aisle, looking at all these options, and you're realizing that more choice doesn't mean better choice. It just means more variations on the same industrial product, more ways to package and market the same underlying problem. The bread has changed, fundamentally and dramatically, and the health consequences are visible in the statistics, in the hospitals, in the endocrinology clinics full of diabetic patients, in the gastroenterology offices full of people with digestive disorders, in the allergy specialists treating people with food sensitivities that didn't exist in previous generations. And the food industry response has been to create more products, not to fix the underlying problem. Gluten-free bread made with rice flour and tapioca starch and xanthan gum, nutritionally worse than wheat bread but marketed to people who can't tolerate wheat. Low-carb bread made with wheat protein isolate and fiber additives, designed for diabetics who are trying to control blood sugar. Keto bread, paleo bread, artisan bread, sourdough bread, all of it industrial, all of it processed, all of it optimized for shelf life and profit, rather than nutrition and health. The young mother is shopping now, and she's confused, overwhelmed by options. She wants to feed her children healthy food, but she doesn't know what healthy means anymore. Is whole wheat better? Is multi-grain better? What about sprouted grain? What about gluten-free? She reads labels, tries to decode ingredient lists, looks for stamps and certifications and health claims. She's doing her best, but the system is designed to confuse her, to make her think she's making informed choices when really she's just choosing between variations of the same industrial product. She picks up a loaf labeled as artisan whole wheat, pays $6 for it, twice the price of regular bread, and feels good about her choice. She doesn't know that artisan doesn't mean anything legally, that it's just a marketing term. She doesn't know that the wheat is still modern high-yield wheat, that the flour is still roller-milled, that the fermentation is still quick and incomplete. She doesn't know that this expensive bread will spike her children's blood sugar just like the cheap bread, that it will contribute to the same metabolic problems, the same inflammatory responses. She's trying to do the right thing, but the right thing isn't available to her. Not here, not in this store, not at a price she can afford with 3 children to feed. You're in a wheat field in Kansas now, and the year is 2025, and what you're seeing looks like every other industrial crop. The wheat is uniform, knee-high, planted in perfect rows that stretch to the horizon. The farmer is in the cab of a massive tractor, air-conditioned, GPS-guided, spraying the field with chemicals. This is the 3rd application this season. First was herbicide in early spring to kill the weeds before planting. Second was fungicide in late spring to prevent rust and other diseases. Now in late summer, just before harvest, he's spraying glyphosate, Roundup, the same chemical people use to kill dandelions in their driveways. He's spraying it directly onto the wheat that will become flour, that will become bread, that people will eat. This practice is called pre-harvest desiccation, and it's standard now, almost universal in conventional wheat farming. The glyphosate kills the wheat plant, dries it out faster than it would die naturally, and makes the harvest more uniform. All the wheat reaches the same moisture content at the same time, which means the farmer can harvest the entire field in one pass instead of multiple passes. It saves time, saves fuel, increases efficiency. The wheat dries in a week instead of 2 weeks. From a purely logistical standpoint, it makes sense. But here's the problem nobody talks about, or at least nobody talks about loudly enough to change the practice. Glyphosate residue ends up in the grain. Studies have found it in over 70% of non-organic wheat products tested. Bread, crackers, pasta, cereals, anything made from conventional wheat probably contains glyphosate residue. Not huge amounts, the levels are within legal limits set by regulatory agencies. But legal limits don't necessarily mean safe limits, especially for chronic exposure over years and decades. And the science on glyphosate is contested, messy, politicized. The World Health Organization's Cancer Research Agency classified it as a probable human carcinogen. Other agencies say it's safe. The manufacturer says it's safe. Independent researchers raise concerns. It's impossible for average consumers to know who to believe. But even if glyphosate doesn't cause cancer, even if it's not acutely toxic, it does something else that's arguably worse for long-term health. It disrupts gut bacteria. Glyphosate is actually an antibiotic, originally patented as such, and it kills bacteria indiscriminately. The beneficial bacteria in your gut, the ones that help you digest food, produce vitamins, regulate your immune system, train your immune system to distinguish between threats and harmless substances, they're sensitive to glyphosate. When you eat bread made from wheat that was sprayed with glyphosate, you're consuming small amounts of an antibiotic with every bite. And over time, over years of eating this bread multiple times per day, your gut microbiome changes. The diversity decreases, beneficial species decline, opportunistic species that can tolerate glyphosate proliferate, your digestive function suffers, your immune system becomes dysregulated, inflammation increases. The farmer doesn't think about this. He's not trying to poison anyone. He's just farming the way he was taught, using the methods that are standard in the industry, following the practices that maximize yield and minimize labor. He's feeding the country, feeding the world, producing wheat that's cheap enough that everyone can afford bread. That's noble, in a way, that's important. But the costs are hidden, externalized, showing up years later in doctors' offices and hospitals, in rising rates of autoimmune disease and metabolic dysfunction, and chronic inflammation. The farmer doesn't see those costs. He just sees the wheat, the yield, the price per bushel. You're watching the spray drift across the field, a fine mist catching the sunlight, and you're thinking about how far removed this is from medieval agriculture. No chemicals, just manure and crop rotation and careful observation. No maximizing yield at all costs, just growing enough to survive, to feed the village, to have seed for next year. The medieval farmer understood limits. He understood that you can't just take from the soil indefinitely, that you have to give back, that agriculture is a relationship between humans and land and plants, not just an extraction process. Modern agriculture treats the soil as a substrate, something to hold the plants upright while you dump synthetic fertilizers on them. The soil in this Kansas field has been depleted, its organic matter declining year after year, its microbial life diminished. The wheat grows because of the chemicals, not because of the soil. Remove the chemicals and nothing would grow here. And this is what your bread is made from. Wheat grown in depleted soil, sustained by synthetic fertilizers, protected by pesticides and herbicides, sprayed with glyphosate right before harvest. Wheat that's genetically far removed from anything your ancestors would recognize. Wheat that's been bred for yield rather than nutrition, for uniformity rather than resilience, for industrial processing rather than human digestion. This wheat becomes flour, becomes bread, becomes the food that makes you sick, slowly, imperceptibly, in ways that are hard to trace back to any single cause, but that add up over time to metabolic disease and inflammation, and all the modern plagues that didn't exist when bread was actually bread. The farmer finishes spraying and drives his tractor back to the barn, and in a few weeks he'll harvest this wheat and sell it to a grain elevator, where it will be mixed with wheat from 100 other farms, and shipped to mills and processed into flour, and distributed to bakeries and grocery stores. And consumers will buy bread made from this wheat and never know about the glyphosate, never know about the depleted soil, never know about the genetic modifications and the industrial processing, and all the ways that this bread is different from the bread that humans ate for thousands of years. They'll just know that bread doesn't satisfy them, that it makes them feel tired and bloated and hungry again an hour later, and they'll blame themselves, their metabolism, their genetics, their lack of discipline. Never the bread, never the system that produces the bread. You're in a small bakery in Copenhagen, and everything about this place feels different from the bakeries you're used to. It's tiny, maybe 15 feet wide, with a stone floor and whitewashed walls, and a wooden counter worn smooth from decades of transactions. Behind the counter, a baker is pulling loaves from a wood-fired oven, and the smell is extraordinary, complex, sour and sweet and yeasty all at once. The loaves are dark, almost black in places, with thick crusts that crack as they cool. These aren't uniform. Some are more brown, some more tan, some have bigger air holes visible through splits in the crust. They look rustic, handmade, the way bread probably looked in medieval times. The baker is explaining his process to a customer who asked. He uses a combination of heritage wheat varieties, mostly spelt and emmer, stone-milled by a small mill outside the city. The flour is never more than a week old, he says, because the oils in the germ go rancid quickly, and he wants the flour fresh. He maintains 4 different sourdough starters, each with its own character, its own combination of wild yeast and bacteria. When he mixes dough, he lets it ferment for at least 24 hours, sometimes 36 hours depending on the temperature and the flour, and how the starter is behaving. He bakes in a wood-fired oven that's been in this building for over 100 years, maintaining it himself, rebuilding parts of it when necessary. The customer asks why he does it this way, why he doesn't use modern methods that would be faster and easier and more profitable. The baker shrugs. Because this is how bread should be made, he says. Because this is what bread is. Everything else is just industrial food product pretending to be bread. He sells maybe 50 loaves a day, which is nothing compared to an industrial bakery, but his customers come back week after week, year after year. Many of them have digestive problems with regular bread but can eat his bread without issue. He's not surprised by this. The wheat is different, the fermentation is proper, the bread is real. Of course people can digest it. You buy a loaf and it's expensive, maybe $8, and it feels heavy in your hand, dense, substantial. You take it home and slice it, and the knife barely cuts through the crust. The interior is chewy, moist, with irregular holes and a complex texture. You eat a slice plain, no butter, no toppings, just the bread itself. The flavor is incredible, tangy, slightly sour, with undertones of wheat and nuts and something almost earthy. It's satisfying in a way that bread hasn't been satisfying to you in years, maybe ever. You eat one slice and you're full, not stuffed, just satisfied, genuinely not hungry anymore. 2 hours later you're still not hungry, 4 hours later still good. This bread is doing what bread is supposed to do, providing sustained energy, keeping you full, nourishing you in ways that go beyond just calories. You're thinking about the price though, $8 for a loaf. That's expensive, genuinely expensive, especially compared to the $2 industrial loaves at the grocery store. If you ate this bread the way medieval peasants ate bread, 2 or 3 pounds a day, you'd spend $20 a day just on bread, $600 a month, $7,200 a year. That's unsustainable for most people, impossible for anyone on a tight budget. Real bread, properly made bread, it's become a luxury item, affordable only to people with disposable income, accessible only in cities with specialty bakeries, available only to those who know to look for it and can afford it when they find it. And this is the tragedy of modern food systems. The cheap bread, the stuff everyone can afford, the stuff that's available everywhere, it's making people sick, slowly, imperceptibly, in ways that take years to manifest as disease. But the real bread, the bread that would actually nourish people, that would prevent rather than cause metabolic problems, it's expensive and rare and inaccessible to most of the population. The economics are backwards. We subsidize corn and soy and industrial wheat, making industrial food cheap. We don't subsidize heritage wheat or stone milling or traditional baking, so real food stays expensive. The market rewards efficiency and scale, not nutrition and health. You're eating another slice of the Copenhagen baker's bread, and you're wondering what it would take to change this system. Not individual change, because individual choices can only do so much when the infrastructure supports industrial food and makes real food expensive and difficult to access. Systemic change, agricultural subsidies redirected toward heritage grains and organic farming, regulations that require honest labeling, that prevent industrial bread from being called artisan or traditional when it's not, education about what real bread is, about how it's made, about why it matters, support for small mills and traditional bakers, changes in food policy that prioritize nutrition over yield, health over profit. But this seems impossible, or at least improbable, because the forces supporting the current system are enormous. Agricultural corporations with billions in revenue, food manufacturers with established supply chains and distribution networks, political lobbying and regulatory capture, consumer habits formed over decades of cheap, convenient, industrial food. Changing all of this would require collective action, political will, a fundamental rethinking of what food systems are for and who they should serve. And that's not happening. Not yet, maybe not ever. So you're left with individual choices, inadequate as they are. You can seek out real bread when you can afford it and when it's available. You can learn to make your own bread, investing the time and effort that proper fermentation requires. You can reduce your bread consumption, finding nutrition elsewhere. Or you can keep eating industrial bread and accept the health consequences, the slow accumulation of metabolic damage, the inflammation and insulin resistance and eventual disease. These are your options in the system as it exists. None of them are ideal. All of them require compromise. You're in your kitchen again, but this time you're doing something different. You've decided to make real bread, properly fermented bread, from scratch. You've ordered heritage wheat flour online, einkorn, because the grocery store doesn't carry it. It arrived in a paper bag, stone ground from a mill in Montana, milled last week according to the date stamp. The flour is darker than you expected, more grey-brown than white, and when you open the bag it smells alive, earthy, nothing like the sterile smell of all-purpose flour. You can see flecks of bran, variations in texture, evidence that this flour contains the whole grain, nothing removed, nothing refined away. You're following instructions you found from a baker who specializes in traditional methods. First you need to make a starter, because you don't have one and you can't buy one at the store. Mix equal parts flour and water, let it sit at room temperature, feed it daily. Wait for wild yeast and bacteria from the air and the flour itself to colonize the mixture. This takes time, maybe 5 days, maybe a week, maybe longer depending on the temperature and humidity and what microorganisms happen to be floating around your kitchen. It feels imprecise, unscientific, almost magical. You're creating life from flour and water, cultivating an ecosystem of microorganisms that will leaven your bread and give it flavor and make it digestible. Day 1, nothing happens. The mixture just sits there, flour and water, looking like paste. Day 2, a few bubbles appear on the surface. Something is happening. Something is alive in there, eating the flour, producing carbon dioxide. Day 3, more bubbles, and the mixture smells slightly sour, acidic, not unpleasant but definitely not neutral. Day 4, it's actively bubbling, expanding, and the smell is stronger, more complex, yeasty and tangy and fermented. Day 5, you feed it again, discarding half and adding fresh flour and water, and within hours it doubles in size, full of air, alive with yeast and bacteria that have established themselves in your kitchen, in this jar, in this flour-water mixture that will become the foundation of your bread. You're surprised by how satisfying this is, watching something come alive, nurturing it, seeing the visible evidence that fermentation is happening. It's the opposite of modern convenience, the opposite of instant gratification. This process requires patience, attention, care. You can't rush it, you can't shortcut it. You have to wait for the microorganisms to do their work, and they work on their own schedule, not yours. But the waiting feels productive, purposeful, connected to something ancient and essential. People have been doing this for thousands of years, maintaining starter cultures, passing them down through generations, keeping this living thing alive that makes bread possible. Now it's time to make actual bread. You mix flour and water and salt and a few spoonfuls of starter. The dough comes together differently than the quick bread you made before. It's stickier, more elastic, harder to work with. You knead it briefly, just enough to develop some structure, and then you let it rest. This is the autolyse, the resting period where the flour fully hydrates and enzymes start breaking down the starches and proteins. After an hour, you stretch and fold the dough a few times, developing gluten structure without heavy kneading. Then you cover it and walk away. The waiting begins, 12 hours, minimum, probably more like 18 or 24 depending on the temperature. You check it periodically, watching it expand slowly, seeing bubbles form under the surface, smelling the developing sourness. It's alive, actively fermenting, and you can see the evidence. This isn't like watching industrial dough puff up quickly from commercial yeast. This is slow, gradual, complex. Multiple species of yeast and bacteria are working together, producing carbon dioxide and organic acids, breaking down phytic acid and lectins, pre-digesting the gluten, transforming the flour into something more digestible, more nutritious, more satisfying. 24 hours later, the dough has doubled in size. You shape it into a loaf, let it rise again for a few hours, and then bake it. The bread that comes out of the oven is dark, crusty, heavy. It doesn't look like grocery store bread. It looks rustic, handmade, imperfect. You let it cool completely, which takes restraint because it smells incredible, and then you slice it. The knife struggles through the thick crust. The interior is dense, chewy, with irregular holes. You taste it. It's different, completely different from any bread you've made before. The flavor is complex, tangy, slightly sour, with depth and character. The texture is substantial, satisfying. You eat one slice and you're full, not just not hungry, actually satisfied, like you've eaten something nourishing, something that your body recognizes as food. An hour later you're still full, your blood sugar hasn't crashed, you don't have the desperate craving for more food that usually hits after eating bread. You feel stable, energized, good. You're realizing that this is what bread is supposed to feel like, what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to satisfy you, sustain you, provide energy that lasts for hours. It's not supposed to be a brief sugar rush followed by a crash in cravings. It's not supposed to make you bloated or tired or foggy. It's supposed to be food, real food, food that nourishes rather than just filling space in your stomach. And you've been eating fake bread your entire life without realizing it, without having a reference point for what real bread is like. But you're also realizing how much work this took. 2 hours of active time spread over 5 days to create the starter, another hour to mix and shape the dough, 24 hours of waiting for fermentation. You made one loaf. One. An industrial bakery makes thousands per hour. The economics don't scale. This method can't feed millions of people cheaply and efficiently. It's too slow, too labor-intensive, too dependent on skill and knowledge and patience. And that's the fundamental problem. Real bread, properly made bread, it's incompatible with industrial food systems that prioritize speed and scale and profit. You're sitting at your table now, eating your homemade bread, and you're doing the math. The flour cost $12 for 2 pounds. You used about £1.5 pounds for this loaf. That's $9 in flour alone, not counting the time, the energy to heat the oven, the water, the salt, the opportunity cost of spending hours over multiple days to make one loaf of bread. If you had to buy bread like this from a bakery, factoring in labor and overhead and profit, it would probably cost $15 or $20 per loaf. And if you ate bread the way medieval peasants did, £2 or £3 per day, that would be $40 or $60 per day, just for bread. $1,200 to $1,800 per month, $20,000 per year, on bread alone. Obviously that's insane. Nobody can afford that. Nobody should have to afford that. Bread is supposed to be cheap, accessible, available to everyone regardless of income. That's been true for most of human history. Bread was the food of the common people, the peasants, the laborers, the poor. It was inexpensive relative to other foods, because wheat grows easily in most climates, stores well, processes into flour that keeps for weeks, bakes into bread that feeds many people from little grain. The economics of bread have always favored accessibility. Until recently, the shift happened gradually. As bread making industrialized, as small bakeries closed and large factories took over, as traditional methods were replaced by rapid mixing and chemical leavening and preservatives, the price of bread dropped dramatically. By the 1970s you could buy a loaf of white bread for 50 cents, by the 2000s still just $1 or $2. Bread became almost absurdly cheap, so cheap that people stopped valuing it, stopped thinking about what went into making it, stopped caring about quality as long as price stayed low. The market optimized for cheapness above all else, and quality suffered accordingly. But real bread, bread made with heritage wheat and stone-milled flour and long fermentation and traditional baking methods, that never got cheaper. If anything, it got more expensive as the infrastructure supporting it disappeared. Small mills closed because they couldn't compete with industrial roller mills. Heritage wheat farmers quit because commodity wheat paid more reliably. Traditional bakers retired, and nobody learned the skills. The knowledge started disappearing, preserved only by hobbyists and a handful of artisan bakers in cities with customers wealthy enough to pay premium prices. So now you have this two-tier system: cheap industrial bread that's available everywhere, affordable to everyone, but nutritionally problematic and potentially harmful, and expensive real bread that's rare, accessible only to people with money and knowledge and proximity to specialty bakeries, but actually nourishing and digestible and health-promoting. The people who most need good food, people on tight budgets, people in food deserts, people without time or resources to bake their own bread, they're stuck with the industrial option. The people who can afford alternatives, who have farmers markets and specialty stores and disposable income, they can choose better. The inequality isn't just economic, it's nutritional, biological, health outcomes diverging based on what kind of bread you can afford. You're thinking about medieval bread prices again, trying to compare across centuries, which is difficult because monetary systems were different, and economies were different, and the relationship between labor and food was different. But roughly, a medieval laborer might spend half a day's wages on enough bread to feed his family for a day. That's expensive by modern standards, but it was normal, expected, sustainable.
People budgeted for bread the way modern people budget for rent. It was the largest expense, but it was manageable because wages, though low, were sufficient to buy bread. Modern wages, even minimum wage, can buy vastly more industrial bread than medieval wages could buy medieval bread. You could work 1 hour at minimum wage and buy 20 loaves of industrial bread. The accessibility is unprecedented in human history. But if you want real bread, heritage wheat bread, properly fermented bread, the equation flips. You might work an hour and afford 1 loaf, maybe 2. The accessibility disappears. Real bread becomes a luxury, something you splurge on occasionally, not something you eat daily as a staple. And this creates a perverse situation where the poorest people, the ones most vulnerable to metabolic disease because they can't afford healthcare and don't have time for exercise and live in stressful circumstances, they're eating the worst bread, the bread most likely to spike blood sugar, trigger inflammation, contribute to obesity and diabetes. While wealthy people, the ones least vulnerable to metabolic disease because they can afford healthcare and gym memberships and low-stress lifestyles, they can afford bread that doesn't cause these problems. The health inequality compounds. The people who most need good nutrition have the least access to it. You finish your slice of homemade bread, and you're feeling satisfied, nourished, grateful that you have the time and money and knowledge to make this. But you're also feeling guilty, because you know most people don't have these advantages, can't spend 5 days cultivating a starter culture, can't afford $12 flour, can't wait 24 hours for dough to ferment when they're working 2 jobs and raising kids and barely have time to sleep. For them, bread means grabbing whatever's cheapest at the grocery store, feeding their families with industrial loaves that cost $2 and last a week in plastic wrap and taste like nothing, and spike blood sugar, and contribute to the exact health problems they can't afford to treat. The system is broken, not just inefficient or imperfect, actually broken, structured in ways that harm the people it's supposed to serve. And fixing it would require more than individual choices, more than shopping at farmers markets or learning to bake or buying organic. It would require restructuring agricultural subsidies, supporting small mills and traditional bakers, educating people about real bread, making heritage wheat and proper fermentation accessible and affordable instead of rare and expensive. It would require prioritizing health over profit, which is exactly what the current system doesn't do, and shows no signs of starting to do.
You're in a classroom now, a middle school health class, and the teacher is presenting the food pyramid. This is 2010, and even though the pyramid has been updated, replaced officially with My Plate, many teachers are still using the old model because that's what they learned, what they have posters for, what's familiar. The pyramid shows grains at the bottom, the foundation, 6 to 11 servings per day recommended. Bread, cereal, rice, pasta. The teacher is explaining that carbohydrates are your body's primary energy source, that you need them to function, that whole grains are especially healthy because they contain fiber and vitamins. The students are taking notes, absorbing this information as fact, as truth delivered by authority figures and reinforced by decades of nutritional guidance. They'll carry these beliefs into adulthood, structure their diets around them, feed their own children based on them. They'll eat bread for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, pasta for dinner, thinking they're being healthy, following the guidelines, doing what they're supposed to do. And in 20 or 30 years, many of them will be diabetic or pre-diabetic, overweight or obese, dealing with inflammatory conditions and metabolic dysfunction, wondering what they did wrong, why their bodies betrayed them when they followed all the rules. Nobody is telling them that the food pyramid was created under intense lobbying from the grain industry. Nobody is explaining that the research it was based on was incomplete, often flawed, influenced by commercial interests. Nobody is mentioning that many of the scientists who developed the guidelines received funding from food companies with vested interests in promoting grain consumption. The pyramid wasn't created solely or even primarily to optimize human health. It was created to support American agriculture, to promote domestic grain production, to encourage consumption of products that American farms produced in abundance. And it worked. Grain consumption increased dramatically after the pyramid was introduced in 1992. Americans started eating more bread, more pasta, more cereal, convinced that carbohydrates were healthy and necessary. Food manufacturers responded by creating countless grain-based products, from granola bars to crackers to frozen dinners built around pasta and rice. The industrial food system boomed, farm profits increased, food companies thrived, and metabolic disease rates exploded because eating 6 to 11 servings of refined grains per day, even whole grains, even the healthy options, it overwhelms your metabolic system. It keeps blood sugar elevated, insulin constantly elevated, cells becoming resistant to insulin, the slow march toward diabetes. The teacher is moving on to other food groups now, but the damage is done. The foundation has been set. Grains are good, grains are necessary, grains are healthy. This message has been repeated so often, so consistently by so many authoritative sources that it's become unquestionable truth in most people's minds. Questioning it feels like questioning gravity or the roundness of the earth. It feels contrarian, conspiracy-minded, unscientific, even though the science supporting high grain consumption is actually weak, contradicted by emerging research on insulin resistance and metabolic health. Even though the historical evidence shows that humans thrived on much lower grain consumption for most of our existence, even though the epidemiological evidence shows metabolic disease rising in direct correlation with increased grain consumption, the cultural belief persists. You're watching a student raise her hand and ask about gluten-free diets, about whether bread is actually healthy, because her aunt stopped eating gluten and lost weight and feels better. The teacher dismisses this, gently but firmly. Gluten-free diets are only necessary for people with celiac disease, she explains. For everyone else, they're just a fad, unnecessarily restrictive, potentially harmful because you're cutting out whole grains which are important for fiber and B vitamins. The student nods, accepts this, writes it down. The aunt's experience, the empirical evidence of feeling better without bread, it's invalidated, explained away as placebo effect or weight loss from calorie restriction. Anything except the obvious possibility that maybe bread, modern bread, industrial bread, is actually problematic for many people beyond just celiacs. The class ends, the students file out, and they'll go to the cafeteria where lunch includes bread with every meal. Sandwiches, garlic bread with pasta, hot dog buns, hamburger buns, dinner rolls. The school lunch program, subsidized by the government, structured around USDA guidelines, actively pushes grain consumption. It's cheap, filling, shelf-stable, easy to prepare in bulk, perfect for institutions feeding hundreds or thousands of people on limited budgets. That it might be contributing to childhood obesity, to early onset diabetes, to metabolic problems that will manifest fully in adulthood. These are costs that show up later, elsewhere, in healthcare systems rather than education budgets. The incentive structure doesn't encourage schools to prioritize long-term health over short-term cost efficiency. You're thinking about how this educational system, this nutritional guidance, has shaped generations of Americans. Kids taught in the 1990s that grains are the foundation of healthy eating, are now adults in their 30s and 40s, many struggling with weight and metabolic issues, feeding their own children the same messages, perpetuating the cycle. The institutional momentum is enormous. Changing the guidelines is difficult, politically fraught, economically complicated. Too many industries depend on high grain consumption. Too many careers are built on defending the current paradigm. Too many people have invested their identity in these nutritional beliefs to easily abandon them. And meanwhile, the health crisis worsens. Obesity rates continue climbing. Type 2 diabetes continues spreading, affecting younger and younger people. Children being diagnosed with what used to be called adult-onset diabetes. The healthcare costs are staggering, hundreds of billions per year treating diseases that are largely preventable through diet. But prevention would require acknowledging that the dietary guidelines have been wrong, that the food pyramid was a mistake, that we've been giving people advice that made them sick. That's a difficult admission for institutions to make. Easier to blame individual choices, lack of willpower, sedentary lifestyles, genetics, anything except the fundamental dietary framework that's been promoted for decades. The school day continues, students eating their grain-heavy lunches, teachers reinforcing nutritional messages that prioritize grain consumption, everyone operating within a system that seems designed to produce metabolic disease, even as it claims to promote health. You're in a doctor's office now, but not as a patient. You're shadowing a physician for the day, watching how she interacts with patients, trying to understand the healthcare system from the inside. It's mid-afternoon, and she's seeing her sixth patient of the day, a man in his late 40s with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and pre-diabetes. His labs are bad and getting worse. His weight has increased 20 pounds in the past year. He's tired all the time, has trouble sleeping, gets frequent headaches. The classic presentation of metabolic syndrome, everything interconnected, everything pointing to the same underlying problem. The doctor asks about his diet, and the patient describes what he thinks is healthy eating. He switched to whole wheat bread and brown rice. He avoids fried foods mostly. He drinks diet soda instead of regular. He eats fruit with breakfast. He's genuinely trying to eat better, but the weight keeps climbing. The numbers keep worsening, and he's frustrated because he feels like he's doing everything right, and his body isn't cooperating. The doctor nods sympathetically, makes notes, and eventually prescribes medications. A statin for cholesterol, a blood pressure medication, metformin for the pre-diabetes. She tells him to keep up with the healthy eating, maybe increase exercise, maybe see a nutritionist. What she doesn't tell him, what she probably doesn't fully understand herself because medical education focuses on treatment rather than prevention, and rarely addresses food quality versus just caloric quantity, is that his healthy diet is still spiking his blood sugar multiple times per day. The whole wheat bread, the brown rice, the fruit, even the diet soda which tricks his body into expecting sugar and triggers insulin release anyway, all of it is contributing to his metabolic problems. His body is constantly dealing with elevated blood sugar and elevated insulin, and over years this has led to insulin resistance,
and the insulin resistance is causing everything else. The weight gain, the high blood pressure, the cholesterol problems, the fatigue, all of it stems from this underlying metabolic dysfunction. But fixing it would require more than just prescribing medications. It would require completely restructuring his diet, eliminating or drastically reducing the foods he's been told are healthy, the whole wheat bread and brown rice and fruit juice. It would require explaining that whole wheat bread still spikes blood sugar dramatically, that brown rice is barely better than white rice metabolically, that fruit juice is basically sugar water even though it comes from fruit. It would require time she doesn't have, 15-minute appointment slots that barely allow for medication management, let alone comprehensive dietary counseling. It would require knowledge she might not have, because her medical training included maybe 1 or 2 lectures on nutrition, focused on calorie counting and food groups, not on the biochemistry of bread, or the metabolic effects of industrial food processing. So she does what the system allows her to do. She prescribes medications that treat symptoms, that lower blood pressure and cholesterol artificially, that help control blood sugar without addressing why it's elevated in the first place. And the patient leaves with 3 new prescriptions, a vague encouragement to eat better and exercise more, and no real understanding of what's actually wrong or how to fix it. He'll take the medications dutifully, experience some improvement in his numbers, feel like the problem is being managed, but the underlying metabolic dysfunction will continue, slowly worsening, requiring increasing medication doses, additional medications, eventual complications, kidney damage, nerve damage, heart disease, stroke, the predictable progression of untreated metabolic syndrome. You're watching the next patient, a woman in her 30s with irritable bowel syndrome, chronic abdominal pain, bloating, alternating constipation and diarrhea. She's been to multiple specialists, had numerous tests, tried various medications, and nothing has really helped. The doctor asks about her diet, and the woman mentions that she eats a lot of bread and pasta because they're bland and usually don't trigger her symptoms immediately. The doctor nods, suggests maybe trying a low FODMAP diet, maybe seeing a gastroenterologist again, maybe trying a different medication. What doesn't happen is a conversation about the quality of the bread and pasta she's eating, about whether modern wheat might be contributing to her symptoms, about whether industrial processing and quick fermentation might be creating inflammatory responses. The woman has never heard of heritage wheat or traditional fermentation, or the difference between modern bread and medieval bread. She just knows that her digestive system doesn't work right, that food is always a gamble, that she's been living with discomfort for years and accepting it as normal because the medical system can't find anything structurally wrong with her intestines. If someone suggested she try bread made from einkorn wheat, properly fermented for 24 hours, she'd probably be skeptical. She's been told she has IBS, which sounds like a real diagnosis, like a thing that exists independent of what she eats. She doesn't realize that IBS is often just a label doctors use when they can't identify a specific pathology, a catch-all diagnosis for digestive problems that don't fit into neat categories. And she doesn't realize that many people with IBS can eat traditional bread without symptoms, that the problem isn't wheat per se but modern wheat and modern processing. She'll probably spend the rest of her life managing symptoms, trying different medications, avoiding foods that trigger her, never fully comfortable, never fully healthy, because nobody in the medical system has the time or knowledge or incentive to dig deeper into what she's actually eating and how it's been processed. The afternoon continues, patient after patient, mostly dealing with chronic conditions that have diet at their root: obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, fatty liver disease, inflammatory bowel conditions, autoimmune disorders. The doctor prescribes medications, offers general advice about eating better and exercising more, moves on to the next patient. She's not uncaring or incompetent. She's working within a system that's designed to treat disease rather than prevent it, that reimburses for prescriptions and procedures but not for extended dietary counseling, that trained her to manage symptoms with pharmaceuticals rather than address root causes with food. She's doing her job as well as the system allows, which unfortunately isn't well enough to actually solve the problems she sees every day. You're in a food laboratory now, a research facility attached to a major university, and scientists are studying the gut microbiome. They're examining stool samples from volunteers who've been eating different types of bread for 6 weeks. One group ate standard supermarket white bread, another group ate supermarket whole wheat bread, a third group ate traditionally fermented sourdough made from heritage wheat. The differences in their gut bacteria are remarkable, visible even to you looking at the data visualizations on the computer screen. The people eating industrial bread, both white and whole wheat, show reduced microbial diversity. Their gut bacteria populations have shifted towards species that thrive in high-sugar, low-fiber environments. Beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, species that help digest food and produce short-chain fatty acids that reduce inflammation, their populations have declined. Opportunistic species that can trigger inflammation and produce compounds associated with metabolic disease, those have increased. The ratio has shifted in unhealthy directions, and this happened in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks of eating industrial bread, and the gut microbiome has measurably changed for the worse. The people eating traditional sourdough show the opposite pattern. Their microbial diversity has increased. Beneficial bacteria populations are thriving. The species that produce butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid that feeds the cells lining your colon and has anti-inflammatory effects throughout your body, those populations have expanded. The researchers are measuring inflammatory markers in blood samples too, and they're lower in the sourdough group, significantly lower, despite all three groups consuming similar amounts of bread and similar total calories. The bread itself, the type of bread, the way it was processed, it's changing the gut microbiome in ways that affect whole body inflammation. One of the researchers is explaining the mechanism. Industrial bread, especially white bread but also whole wheat bread made with quick fermentation, it's essentially predigested starch. It breaks down rapidly in your small intestine, gets absorbed quickly as glucose, leaving little fiber to reach your colon. Your gut bacteria in the colon, they feed on fiber, on complex carbohydrates that your own digestive enzymes can't break down. When you eat industrial bread, you're starving those bacteria. The beneficial species that depend on fiber decline. Species that can survive on other food sources, including ones that feed on the mucus layer protecting your intestinal lining, those increase. Over time, this can lead to a degraded mucus barrier, increased intestinal permeability, a condition sometimes called leaky gut, where partially digested food particles and bacterial components can cross into your bloodstream and trigger immune responses. Traditional sourdough, on the other hand, especially when made from whole grain flour, it reaches your colon still partially intact. The fiber hasn't been removed. The long fermentation has created resistant starch that resists digestion in the small intestine and makes it to the colon, where bacteria can ferment it. This feeds beneficial bacteria, promotes microbial diversity, produces those short-chain fatty acids that reduce inflammation. The bread is acting as a prebiotic, food for your gut bacteria, supporting the microbial ecosystem that's essential for digestive health, immune function, even mental health through the gut-brain axis. You're looking at microscope images now, gut bacteria from the different groups, and even though you're not a trained microbiologist, you can see differences. The samples from industrial bread eaters look less dense, less diverse, like a forest that's been partially clear-cut. The samples from sourdough eaters look like thriving ecosystems, dense populations of varied bacterial species, the kind of diversity that indicates health. This is your gut. This is what's happening inside you every time you eat bread. Every meal shaping your microbiome. Every choice either supporting or degrading this internal ecosystem that affects everything from digestion to immunity to mood. The researchers are discussing implications, talking about publishing their findings, hoping to influence public health policy. But they're also realistic about the challenges. The food industry won't like this research. It suggests that their products are harming people's gut health, contributing to inflammation and metabolic disease. There will be pushback, demands for more studies, arguments about methodology, funded research from industry groups showing different results. The truth will get muddied, contested, delayed. Meanwhile, millions of people will keep eating industrial bread, unaware that every loaf is reshaping their gut bacteria in harmful ways, contributing to problems they won't connect to bread because the effects are gradual, cumulative, invisible until they manifest as disease. One researcher mentions that she started baking her own sourdough at home, using the methods from the study. She's noticed improvements in her digestion, her energy, her overall feeling of well-being. Her colleagues tease her gently, call her a convert, but several of them have started doing the same thing. When you understand the science, when you see the data, when you know what industrial bread is doing to gut bacteria, it becomes hard to keep eating it. Knowledge changes behavior, at least for people who have the resources and time to act on that knowledge. But most people don't have this knowledge. They don't read research papers. They don't see microscope images of gut bacteria. They just know that bread is supposed to be healthy, that whole wheat is better than white, that they should eat whole grains as part of a balanced diet. They follow the guidelines they learned in school, reinforced by food packaging and health authorities, and they trust that these guidelines are based on complete, unbiased science. They don't realize that the science is incomplete, that crucial research on bread quality and gut health exists but hasn't filtered into public awareness, that the dietary advice they're following might be decades out of date or influenced by commercial interests. The lab visit is ending, and you're leaving with a deeper understanding of what bread does at a microscopic level, how it shapes the invisible ecosystem inside you, how different types of bread create different microbial environments with different health outcomes. This isn't just about calories or macronutrients or even glycemic index. It's about the complex interaction between food, bacteria, and human cells, a relationship that's been optimized over thousands of years of eating traditional bread and disrupted over decades of eating industrial bread. Your body knows the difference. Your gut bacteria know the difference, even if your conscious mind doesn't. You're in a grain elevator now, somewhere in the Midwest, watching wheat from dozens of farms get mixed together in massive silos. Trucks arrive throughout the day, dump their loads, and the wheat flows together, indistinguishable, anonymous. This is commodity wheat, sold by weight and protein content. with no consideration for variety or terroir or growing practices beyond basic grades. The farmer who used glyphosate for pre-harvest desiccation, his wheat mixes with wheat from the farmer who didn't. Wheat grown in depleted soil mixes with wheat from better maintained fields. Everything becomes uniform, standardized, processed down to specifications that matter for milling and baking but not for nutrition or digestibility or health. The grain elevator operator is explaining the grading system. Wheat is classified by protein content, moisture level, presence of foreign material, damaged kernels. High protein wheat, over 13%, goes to bread manufacturers. Medium protein goes to all-purpose flour production. Low protein becomes cake flour or pastry flour. The classification is purely functional, concerned only with how the wheat will perform in industrial baking, how much gluten it will develop, how much water it will absorb, how the dough will behave in high-speed mixers. Nobody is checking for nutrient density, for glyphosate residue, for the specific gluten proteins that might trigger immune responses. Those factors aren't part of the grading system because they don't matter for industrial food production. This wheat will go to mills where it will be blended further, mixed with wheat from other elevators, other regions, even other countries, to create a consistent product. Consistency is crucial for industrial baking. Recipes are standardized, processes are automated, and the flour needs to behave predictably batch after batch, day after day. Natural variation, the kind that characterized medieval wheat where every field was slightly different, every harvest unique, that's unacceptable in industrial systems. Variation creates inefficiency, requires adjustment, complicates automation. So variation is removed through blending, through mixing dozens or hundreds of wheat varieties until the specific characteristics of any individual variety disappear into an averaged-out product. You're thinking about what's lost in this process. The farmer who carefully maintains his soil, who rotates crops, who minimizes chemical use. His wheat gets mixed with wheat from farmers who don't care about soil health or long-term sustainability. There's no price premium for quality wheat, no market incentive for growing wheat carefully, no reward for producing grain that's more nutritious or less contaminated. The only incentive is yield. More bushels per acre means more money, regardless of what those bushels contain or how they were produced. The market has reduced wheat to a commodity, stripped it of identity, judged it purely on quantity and functional properties rather than quality or health outcomes. This is fundamentally different from how wheat was treated historically. A medieval miller knew where his wheat came from, often knew the specific fields, could identify the variety by looking at it. Quality mattered because the miller's reputation depended on producing good flour, and bakers' reputations depended on making good bread, and there was direct feedback from customers who could tell the difference between good bread and bad bread. The system rewarded quality because quality was visible, tangible, immediate. The miller who produced rancid flour lost customers. The baker who made sour bread lost customers. Quality was enforced through direct consumer feedback in local markets where everyone knew everyone, and reputation was currency. The industrial system breaks this feedback loop. Consumers are so far removed from grain production that they can't distinguish quality wheat from poor quality wheat. They buy bread based on price and convenience and packaging, not on actual quality, because actual quality is invisible to them. They can't taste the difference between bread made from carefully grown wheat and bread made from chemically intensive wheat, because both have been processed so heavily that the original grain characteristics are obscured. They can't feel the difference in their bodies immediately, because the effects are cumulative, showing up years later as metabolic disease and inflammation, too delayed to connect clearly to any specific food choice. So the system optimizes for what it can measure easily: yield, price, functional properties, and quality, real quality, the factors that affect nutrition and health and long-term well-being. Those disappear because they're not measured, not rewarded, not valued by the commodity system. The wheat flowing through this grain elevator is all legally wheat, all meets the minimum standards, all will be sold and milled and baked into bread. But it's a far cry from the wheat that built civilizations, that sustained humans for millennia, that fed medieval peasants who worked harder than most modern people can imagine, and stayed healthy doing it. The operator is showing you the testing equipment now. Devices that measure moisture content and protein percentage and falling number, a measure of enzyme activity that predicts how the flour will behave in baking, sophisticated technology, precise measurements, scientific management of grain quality, but none of it measures what really matters for human health. None of it asks whether this wheat is nourishing, whether it's been contaminated with chemicals, whether its genetic structure has been altered in ways that make it harder to digest, whether it will spike blood sugar or trigger inflammation or contribute to metabolic disease. Those questions aren't part of the commodity wheat system because answering them would complicate the system, reduce efficiency, increase costs. The wheat continues flowing, tons per hour, eventually filling rail cars that will carry it to mills and processing facilities across the country. Somewhere in this undifferentiated mass of grain might be wheat that's actually good, grown carefully, harvested thoughtfully, worthy of becoming real bread, but it's mixed with so much other wheat, averaged out, diluted, its specific characteristics lost in the blending, that by the time it reaches consumers as flour, as bread, its origins are irrelevant, untraceable, forgotten. The system has transformed wheat from something specific and particular, with identity and character and variation, into a fungible commodity, as standardized and anonymous as crude oil or corn syrup, or any other industrial input. You're standing in a cemetery now, an old one in rural England where weathered headstones date back to the 1300s and 1400s. The inscriptions are worn, barely legible, but you can make out some names, some dates. You're looking at a grave marker for someone who died in 1347 at age 56. Another from 1398 died at 49. Another from 1422 died at 61. These aren't unusual ages for people who survived childhood in medieval times. The life expectancy statistics you've heard, the ones that say medieval people died in their 30s, those are misleading because they include infant and child mortality, which was catastrophically high. But if you survived to adulthood, if you made it past your 20th birthday, you had a decent chance of reaching your 50s or 60s, sometimes older. And these people, the ones buried here, they ate bread for 70% of their calories, every single day. 2-3 pounds of bread, dense, dark, whole grain bread, naturally fermented, stone ground, from heritage wheat. This was their staple food, their primary nutrition, and it sustained them through lives of brutal physical labor in a world without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without any of the healthcare infrastructure you take for granted. They died from infections, from injuries, from complications of childbirth, from diseases that are easily treatable now. But they didn't die from metabolic disease. They didn't die from diabetes or heart disease or obesity-related complications. Their bread, the foundation of their diet, wasn't killing them slowly the way modern bread kills slowly, invisibly, through mechanisms that take decades to manifest as disease. You're thinking about the paradox of modern life. You have vastly better healthcare, vastly better living conditions, vastly better technology. You should be healthier than medieval peasants by every measure. And in many ways you are. You'll probably live longer, overall, when you account for not dying from infected cuts or childbirth or plague. But in terms of metabolic health, in terms of chronic disease, in terms of the slow accumulation of inflammatory damage that characterizes modern illness, you might actually be worse off. Because medieval peasants, despite their harsh lives, despite their lack of medical care, despite their poverty and hardship, they were eating real food, food that their bodies could process, that nourished rather than harmed, that sustained health rather than slowly eroding it. The irony is overwhelming. The poorest people in medieval society, the ones with the least access to variety and luxury in their diet, they were eating better bread than you can easily buy today. Their bread, which they probably didn't think about or appreciate because it was just bread, just the foundation of every meal, it was actually superior in every way that matters for health. More nutritious, more digestible, less inflammatory, less likely to spike blood sugar. They had limited food options and ate bread because they had to, because it was cheap and available and filling. You have unlimited food options and eat bread because you choose to, because you trust it's healthy, because you've been told whole grains are good for you. But the bread they ate by necessity was better than the bread you eat by choice. This cemetery is quiet, peaceful, and you're surrounded by evidence of lives lived fully on a bread-based diet. These people worked in fields, built churches, raised families, survived wars and plagues and famines, and they did it fueled primarily by bread. Not bread from plastic bags with ingredient lists full of chemicals, not bread made from genetically modified wheat sprayed with herbicides, not bread rushed through production in 3 hours with no fermentation. Real bread, simple bread, bread that had been perfected over thousands of years through trial and error, through accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, through processes that worked even if the people using them didn't understand why they worked. You're walking among the graves, reading the inscriptions that are still legible, and you're noticing something else. Multiple generations of the same families, buried together, grandparents, parents, children, all in proximity, all part of the same community, all eating the same bread from the same bakeries, all sustained by the same grain grown in the same fields. This was stability, continuity, tradition. The bread recipe didn't change dramatically from generation to generation. The wheat varieties didn't get replaced every decade. The milling process didn't get revolutionized by new technology. Things stayed the same, mostly because they worked, because there was no compelling reason to change them. The modern world has rejected this stability in favor of constant innovation, constant optimization, constant change, and many of those changes have been beneficial. But in the case of bread, in the case of wheat, the changes have been catastrophic. We've innovated ourselves into a health crisis, optimized grain production in ways that maximized yield while minimizing nutrition, changed bread so fundamentally that it's barely recognizable as the same food. And we've done it so gradually, over so many decades, with each change seeming reasonable in isolation, that most people don't realize it happened. They just know that bread doesn't satisfy them, that it seems to make them gain weight, that it triggers problems they can't quite identify, and they blame themselves, their bodies, their metabolism. Never the bread. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and you're standing here among graves of people who lived 700 years ago, people who ate bread you'd probably consider primitive or inadequate, and you're realizing that their bread was actually superior to yours, that in this one specific way, in this one crucial aspect of daily nutrition, they had it better than you do. Despite all your advantages, all your technology, all your wealth and access and options, you're eating worse bread than medieval peasants, and that bread, that downgrade in quality disguised as progress, it's contributing to diseases that will kill millions of people, slowly, over decades, through mechanisms that are hard to trace but devastating in their cumulative effect. You're in a meeting now, a public health policy meeting at a government building, and officials are discussing the obesity and diabetes epidemic. The statistics are projected on a screen: 42% obesity rate among American adults, 11% with diagnosed diabetes, another 31% pre-diabetic. The costs are staggering, hundreds of billions per year in direct healthcare expenses, trillions when you count lost productivity, disability, premature death. This is a crisis, everyone agrees. Something must be done. The proposals are what you'd expect: public education campaigns about healthy eating and exercise, restrictions on soda and junk food marketing to children, taxes on sugary drinks, subsidies for fruits and vegetables, better nutrition labels, more physical education in schools, walkable communities, programs targeting low-income neighborhoods where obesity rates are highest. All of these are well-intentioned, evidence-based to varying degrees, politically feasible enough to have a chance of implementation. But you're noticing what's not being discussed. Nobody is talking about bread. Nobody is mentioning wheat. Nobody is questioning whether the fundamental dietary guidelines that recommend 6 to 11 servings of grains per day might be contributing to the problem. Nobody is suggesting that maybe, possibly, the industrialization of bread and the genetic modification of wheat and the rapid processing methods that eliminate fermentation might be relevant to an epidemic of metabolic disease. One official mentions whole grains, suggests promoting whole grain consumption as part of the healthy eating campaign. Several others nod in agreement. Whole grains are healthy after all. The science says so. The dietary guidelines recommend them. The food pyramid, even in its updated forms, emphasizes them. Nobody questions this. Nobody asks whether whole grain industrial bread is meaningfully different from white industrial bread in terms of metabolic impact. Nobody wonders why obesity and diabetes rates continued climbing, even as whole grain consumption increased over the past few decades. The assumption that grains are inherently healthy, that more grain consumption is better, it's so deeply embedded in nutritional thinking that it's invisible, unquestionable, axiomatic. You're thinking about how difficult it would be to challenge this assumption in a meeting like this. If you stood up and suggested that bread itself, not just refined bread but all industrial bread including whole wheat, might be a major contributor to metabolic disease, you'd be dismissed as a crank. You'd be asked for evidence, and the evidence exists but it's scattered across multiple disciplines, buried in journals, contradicted by industry-funded studies, obscured by the complexity of nutritional science. You'd be accused of promoting a fad diet, of fear-mongering, of ignoring the established science. Because the established science, the consensus that's been built over decades, says that whole grains are healthy and people should eat more of them. Challenging that consensus requires overturning careers, admitting mistakes, restructuring entire industries, and institutions don't do that easily or willingly. The agricultural lobby would fight any suggestion that wheat is problematic. Billions of dollars in farm subsidies, entire regional economies built around wheat production, political power concentrated in wheat-growing states, all of that would mobilize against policies that question grain consumption. The food manufacturing industry would fight even harder. Bread is a massive market, tens of billions per year, and that's just direct bread sales. Include all grain-based processed foods and you're talking about a substantial portion of the entire food industry. They're not going to accept policies that suggest their products are harmful, that threaten their market share, that could trigger liability concerns or regulatory action. So the conversation continues without ever touching on bread quality, or wheat genetics, or fermentation, or any of the factors you now understand are crucial. The officials settle on proposals that won't upset major industries, that focus on individual behavior change rather than structural problems with the food supply, that treat obesity as a personal failing rather than a systemic issue rooted in industrial food production. They'll launch campaigns telling people to eat better and exercise more, which people already know they should do and mostly can't sustain because the food system is designed to promote overconsumption and because metabolic dysfunction makes weight loss incredibly difficult. They'll implement small changes around the margins, and obesity rates will continue climbing, and in a few years they'll have another meeting to discuss why their interventions didn't work and what new strategies they should try. The meeting is adjourning now, and officials are gathering their papers, chatting about other topics, heading to their next appointments. None of them will go home and think about bread. None of them will question the slice of whole wheat toast they eat for breakfast or the sandwich they have for lunch. They're following the guidelines they helped create, eating what they believe is healthy, contributing to their own metabolic dysfunction, while creating policies that won't solve the problem because the policies can't address root causes without threatening powerful interests. You're leaving the building, and outside in the city, you're surrounded by evidence of the crisis they were discussing. People of every age, many visibly overweight, many probably pre-diabetic or diabetic, all living in a food environment that promotes overconsumption and metabolic disease. And you're wondering what it would take to actually fix this, to restructure the food system in ways that prioritize health over profit, to resurrect traditional bread making on a scale that could feed millions, to make real bread affordable and accessible to everyone regardless of income. It would require massive investment in infrastructure, stone mills to replace roller mills, heritage wheat farming instead of commodity wheat, support for traditional bakers, changes to agricultural subsidies that currently favor industrial grain production, regulations requiring honest labeling, preventing industrial bread from being marketed as artisan or traditional, education campaigns that actually explain what real bread is and why it matters, protections for small farmers and millers against competition from industrial producers who can undercut on price. All of this would cost money, create winners and losers, disrupt existing industries, face fierce political opposition. It's probably not going to happen. Not in the current political and economic system, not when the incentives all point in the wrong direction, not when the agricultural and food lobbies have so much power. So the crisis will continue, and people will keep getting sick, and healthcare costs will keep climbing, and officials will keep having meetings about what to do, and nothing fundamental will change. The system will persist because systems are designed to persist, because changing them requires overcoming enormous inertia and defeating powerful interests, and admitting mistakes that people's careers are built on denying. You're back in your kitchen one last time, and it's early morning, the kind of quiet hour when the world feels suspended between night and day. You're pulling a loaf of bread from the oven, your third attempt at traditional sourdough, and this one finally looks right. Dark crust, proper spring, the sound it makes when you tap the bottom is hollow and resonant. You set it on a rack to cool, and the smell fills your kitchen, complex and alive, nothing like the flat, generic smell of industrial bread. You made this, flour and water and salt and thyme, nothing else, and somehow those simple ingredients transformed into something that feels almost sacred in its simplicity. You're thinking about everything you've learned, about the journey from medieval wheat fields to modern grocery stores, about how bread went from being the staff of life to being a contributor to metabolic disease, about the thousands of small decisions and compromises and optimizations that led to this transformation. And you're thinking about how knowing this changes things, how you can't unknow what you now understand about gluten structures and fermentation chemistry and gut bacteria and blood sugar responses. You can't go back to buying plastic-wrapped industrial bread without thinking about what's in it, what's been done to it, what it's doing to your body. But you're also thinking about how insufficient individual knowledge is, how your personal choices to seek out better bread or make your own bread, those don't solve the systemic problem. You're privileged to have the time and money and knowledge to do this. Most people don't. They're working multiple jobs, raising kids alone, living paycheck to paycheck, shopping at stores that only carry industrial bread because that's what the distribution system delivers to their neighborhoods. They can't afford $15 heritage wheat loaves. They can't spend 2 days making bread from scratch. They're trapped in a food system that offers them cheap, convenient, harmful options and makes real food expensive and inaccessible. And yet individual choices matter too, even if they're insufficient. Every time someone chooses real bread over industrial bread, they're supporting small farmers and traditional bakers and stone mills. They're creating demand for quality, voting with their dollars for a different kind of food system. If enough people do this, if the market shifts even slightly, it creates opportunities for more farmers to grow heritage wheat, more bakers to open traditional bakeries, more mills to invest in stone grinding equipment. Change has to start somewhere. Even if individual choices alone can't create systemic change, they can be part of the momentum that eventually builds into systemic change. You slice into your bread now, and the crumb is good, irregular holes, chewy texture, that slight sour smell that indicates proper fermentation. You eat a slice plain, just bread, tasting it carefully, noticing the complexity of flavor that develops as you chew, the way it satisfies in a deep, fundamental way. This is what bread should be. This is what it was for thousands of years. And you're one person in one kitchen who's learned to make it again, who's recovered knowledge that was almost lost, who's participating in a quiet revival of traditional food that's happening in small pockets around the world. There are farmers growing einkorn and emmer and spelt, bucking the commodity system, selling directly to customers who care about quality. There are millers operating stone mills, often at a loss initially, believing that real flour matters enough to preserve the craft. There are bakers opening small bakeries, fermenting dough for 24 hours, charging prices that reflect the actual cost of making real bread, educating customers about why it's different. These people are swimming against the current of industrial food production, fighting economic forces that favor consolidation and efficiency and scale. Many of them struggle financially, some fail and close, but others persist, and slowly, gradually, the movement grows. You're thinking about Thomas the medieval baker, about how he would view all of this. He never thought about his bread as special, or traditional, or artisan. It was just bread, the only bread he knew how to make, the bread everyone ate because that's what bread was. If you could bring him forward in time, show him a modern grocery store, explain what happened to bread over the centuries, what would he think? Would he be horrified by the industrial loaves, by the chemical additives, by the 3-hour production time? Would he recognize them as bread at all, or would he see them as something else entirely, some strange modern food product that happens to be called bread, but bears no real relationship to the thing he spent his life making? You can't ask him, obviously. He's been dead for 700 years, but you can honor what he knew, what his craft represented, what his bread accomplished. You can learn to make bread the way he made it, or support bakers who do, or at least understand what was lost when bread became industrialized. You can carry that knowledge forward, share it, teach it, keep it alive for another generation, because knowledge, once lost, is incredibly difficult to recover, and the knowledge of how to make real bread, how to grow appropriate wheat, how to mill it properly, how to ferment it traditionally, that knowledge is endangered, kept alive by a relative handful of people working against the economic current. You're standing at a farmer's market now, on a Saturday morning, and there's a baker here selling sourdough made from heritage wheat. His table has maybe a dozen loaves, dark and rustic and beautiful, and they're expensive, $8 or $10 each, and people are buying them anyway. You watch a young couple examining a loaf, asking questions about the wheat variety, about the fermentation time, about whether it's really that different from store-bought sourdough. The baker explains patiently, like he's explained hundreds of times before, about einkorn and stone milling and wild yeast cultures. The couple buys a loaf, carefully, almost reverently, like they're buying something precious rather than just bread. And maybe they are buying something precious. Maybe real bread, properly made bread, bread that nourishes rather than harms. Maybe that is precious in a world where most bread is industrial and inflammatory and metabolically problematic. Maybe the high price reflects the actual value, the actual cost of making food that's worthy of being called food. Maybe we've been living in a brief, aberrant period where bread became artificially cheap through industrialization and chemical agriculture and exploitation of resources. And this expensive artisan bread at the farmer's market, maybe this represents a return to the normal economics of bread, to what it actually costs to grow wheat carefully and mill it properly and ferment it traditionally. You buy a loaf yourself from this baker who's probably not making much profit, who's probably doing this more out of passion than business sense, who believes that bread matters enough to make it right, even when making it right is harder and less profitable. You'll take it home, slice it carefully, eat it slowly, appreciate it fully, and you'll remember everything you've learned about medieval wheat fields and modern grain elevators, about stone mills and roller mills, about wild yeast and commercial yeast, about gut bacteria and blood sugar and inflammation. You'll remember that bread used to be the staff of life, and could be again, if we chose to make it so, if we restructured our food systems to prioritize health over profit, if we recovered the knowledge that's been lost and made it accessible to everyone, rather than just those who can afford expensive loaves at farmers' markets. The market is crowded now, people buying vegetables and cheese and eggs and bread, participating in an alternative food system that exists alongside and in opposition to the industrial system. It's small, this alternative system. It serves maybe 1 or 2% of the population, probably less. It can't feed everyone, not as currently structured, not at current prices and scale, but it proves that another way is possible. It demonstrates that real food still exists, that traditional methods still work, that people will pay for quality when they understand what quality means and why it matters. You're walking home with your bread, and you pass a supermarket where people are buying industrial loaves for $2, unaware that what they're buying isn't really bread in any historical sense, isn't the food that sustains civilizations, isn't the staff of life, but rather a processed product that happens to be called bread. You can't blame them for not knowing. The information is available but obscure, contradicted by official dietary guidelines, opposed by powerful industries. They're doing their best with the knowledge they have and the resources available to them. They're feeding their families the way they've been taught to feed families, following advice that's been given to them by authorities they trust. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that industrial bread exists, because industrialization was an attempt to feed growing populations cheaply, and that impulse, that desire to make food accessible to everyone, that's noble even if the execution was flawed. The tragedy is that people don't know there's a difference. They don't know that bread used to be different, that their great-grandparents ate better bread despite being poorer, that the metabolic diseases they're suffering from are partly caused by a food they've been told is healthy. The tragedy is the loss of knowledge, the forgetting of how bread should be made, the acceptance of industrial products as normal when they're actually aberrations in the long history of human bread consumption. But you know now, you can't unknow it, and maybe that's enough, for today, for this moment. You know what real bread is, you know how it's made, you know why it matters. You can make different choices, share what you've learned, participate in the quiet revival of traditional food. You can't fix the system alone. You can't restructure agricultural subsidies, or rewrite dietary guidelines, or change the economics of industrial food production. But you can make bread, real bread, and in making it, in eating it, In understanding it, you're keeping alive knowledge that matters, that's worth preserving, that might someday, somehow, become common again, rather than rare. The night is settling in now, deep and quiet, and you're sitting with a slice of bread and a cup of tea, just breathing, just being. The bread tastes like patience, like time measured in hours instead of minutes, like care that can't be rushed, like knowledge accumulated over generations and nearly lost and barely recovered. Outside your window, the city continues its restless motion, people eating dinner, living their lives, mostly unaware of what they've lost or what might be recovered, and that's okay. That's how change happens, slowly, person by person, loaf by loaf, until one day the strange becomes familiar and the forgotten becomes remembered. For now, though, there's just this bread, this quiet moment, this small connection to something ancient and essential. The recipe was never really lost. It was just sleeping, waiting for someone to remember why it mattered. And maybe, in the quiet of your kitchen, in the bread cooling on your counter, in the knowledge settling into your bones, maybe it's waking up again, slowly, the way bread rises, the way civilizations were built. One day, one loaf, one person at a time. The staff of life, still standing, still sustaining, still waiting to be recognized for what it always was. Just bread, real bread, the way it should be, the way it could be again. Let that thought settle softly as you drift toward sleep, toward rest, toward the quiet knowledge that some things, once understood, change everything. And bread, simple bread, might just be one of them.